Hello people, and thank you for tuning into XPol. Today, I'm talking with Chad Matheny. Chad is a musician with an atypical profile. He's a jack of all trades with a wide range of interests. He's a trained physicist, former biology teacher, web developer, audio engineer, music business lecturer, and philosophy enthusiast. He has released several albums and toured the world under the name Emperor X. He also operates a jazz and experimental music venue in Berlin called Donau 115. Chad was one of the lecturers in my former music university, and I liked his teaching style instantaneously. We had a few spontaneous conversations that were very illuminating, and so it was a natural thing for me to invite him on the podcast. What we tried to do here is to recreate such a conversation and to record it. Chad expressly asked me not to let him know in advance what I plan to discuss, and at his behest, I came up with an original way to get the conversation started. Now, I'm going to present a short summary of the episode. If you just want to follow the flow of the conversation as it unfolded, I invite you to skip to the beginning of the interview using the timecodes. As usual, you also have footnotes available at the end of the podcast, which are indicated by this sound. Okay, so it was admittedly difficult to split this episode in two parts, as we've made it a point to, quote, embrace the rhizome and to follow tangents wherever they would lead us. So here is a tentative overview of the episode. We start off by a brief consideration of the nature of recorded conversations. Then, I read to him Antonin Artaud's translation of the poem Jabberwocky, written by Lewis Carroll, and we discuss the art of translation, semiotics, hermeneutics, and the origins of language and music. We move on to talk about shifting media consumption habits, namely the so-called pivot to video, and what it implies for culture and artists. We reflect on teaching, and Chad shares his experience and the role it plays in his life. We talk about what we'll leave behind and what it might mean for future archaeologists. We discuss choice-making and creativity in a practically infinite universe, his role as an artist, and we go into detail about some of his songs. We also share some thoughts about the impact of streaming services and the evolution of the music business, both in general and in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, we wrap up by talking about video games and the value of suspension of disbelief. Okay, well, that's it for introduction. Without further delay, here is Chad Matheny. Hello, Chad, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, Baptiste. I've been looking forward to this, genuinely.
I'm really excited. I was thinking, and we were talking about it over email, but maybe we'll do something a bit different today. Less of an interview and more of what you called actually a Rhizomic Conversation.
Uh-huh. Yeah. As you and I tend to have from time to time.
Yeah, exactly. Like just try to capture that in a recorded setting, which is maybe harder than, it's not that simple.
Well, that's the problem here, right? When you're interviewing people, it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but psychologically, right? Like you can't record a conversation without expecting the recording to impact the conversation. But that doesn't mean that the recording process is necessarily inauthentic. It just means that it's slightly different. Like you can correct for the Heisenberg uncertainty principle to some degree. So yeah, we'll see how that works.
Yeah, and that's when long form becomes interesting because you just cannot be in panic mode for so long. So maybe for the first 5 minutes of the podcast, wow, we're recording this. But then it just becomes more of a normal conversation. At least that's how it feels to me. But
yeah, same.
Okay, so you told me to not tell you about anything I prepared.
That's right. Which is one of the main reasons why I've been looking forward to this so much, actually.
So I'm going to read something to you.
Okay.
And I just want to know how you feel about it. Maybe you can guess what it is. I would be amazed. But yeah, let's try this.
Okay.
Néant homo notar nemo. Il était reparent. Et les vliques tarants allaient en gibroyant et en brimbule triquant, jusque-là où la rourgue est à rouargue, à rangde, et rangde à rouargande. Tous les phalomitards étaient les chats huants, et les gorées hucati dans le grabugement. So that's it. That's a few verses.
It's poetry. It's obvious. My French is garbage, so I could pick up nothing.
Yeah, well, me neither. That's a French translation of the poem Jabberwocky.
Wow. Wow.
By Lewis Carroll. And it's, it's notorious nonsense in a way, but...
Wow. A phonetic translation in a sense, because how can you translate... It's basically you're translating phonemes then, right?
Well, that's a very good question. There is a book that has been written about this. That's the first 4 verses of Jabberwocky, and there's a French literary teacher that wrote an entire book about different translations of the first 4 verses. And so I feel like that is just one version, and that is one very specific version. But there are a bunch of them, and in a way, strangely, usually you feel like something is lost in translation.
But here I almost feel like something is gained because I have 4 or 5 translations, and in English you only have one version of Jabberwocky.
Wow. I've actually never thought about the notion of translating phonemes and getting the same point across, but when you don't have a point, I mean, with Jabberwocky, it's not like, I mean, I don't know, maybe he had a point somewhere, but the meaning behind the words it's much less about the words themselves and much more about like how they hit your ear. And this is fascinating to me because like as somebody who speaks a language that isn't English, of course, it's going to hit your ear differently. So maybe the translation there is trying to find the same kind of hit for someone who speaks native French. I'm reminded of this thought that I had when I was a kid, where I thought like, well, I'm seeing pink, and of course, then I wound up reading Philosophy 101 textbooks later and realizing that way bigger people than me had thought about this. But I would see a color, and I remember thinking like, well, how like that blue isn't necessarily blue for somebody else. Like the blue that I'm seeing is maybe the blue that I'm seeing is similar in effect to the yellow that somebody else sees. And there's no way for me to verify this or know this. And I think similarly with like the way a phoneme impacts you, like when I say tuck, that's a meaningless phoneme for me in English. But if the closer the phoneme is to an actual semantic content in someone's language, probably the less neutral it becomes. So if I were trying to translate this, I would really have to look for like neutral phonemes in the language, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever tried to like pretend to speak a language that you don't know, but you try to get the sound of it?
Yes. I tried this with my ex-girlfriend, actually. We were trying to speak each other's languages to each other. And that worked pretty well, actually. We could have conversations.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I think the better you know a language, the less possible that becomes. So when I first moved to Germany, I amused my German friends by speaking fake German. And now that my German is better, I can't do it anymore because my ability to do that in a pure, unpolluted way is obliterated because now I think in terms of words, not in terms of phonemes. It becomes less about a spray of sound and more about like a library that I can go to automatically. Whereas if I'm speaking like Kazakh or something, like I have no idea which way is up. Or Hebrew is a great example because it's there aren't many, other than literal cognates, there aren't many common root words with European languages. So I could just like make a bunch of sounds, and to me it would sound Hebrew, and to a Hebrew person it would sound like they had a stroke.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But it would sound conceivably like Hebrew. So I wonder if so who did this translation? Who are these people?
So yeah, I feel like what you're saying, in a way, we are getting to the point that I was hoping to touch on with that thing, because this is a translation from Antonin Artaud, who's a French writer. And what's interesting about this translation is that he read the English version and he claimed that basically Lewis Carroll had plagiarized him. That was like an anticipated plagiarism because actually he lived 100 years later. And he claimed that this was just a bad translation of his own Jabberwocky in English. And granted, like the translation was part of an art therapy session that he had in an asylum while he was getting electroshock therapy as well. So maybe that had maybe that had some to do about that. And he translated an entire chapter of Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, and he entitled it, it's like a translation, analysis and translation against Lewis Carroll. So it's an antagonistic translation.
Oh my God.
Such a strange idea. And
yes.
And someone who was really interested by this was Deleuze.
Aha. Okay.
And so
I see where we're going here.
Yeah. And he's been characterizing this translation as anti-grammatical. Because as you just said, in a way, when you learn a language and you learn about the meaning and the sense, meaning tends to crowd out the entire gestalt of the language and the way it feels as an entire thing. And in many ways, Artaud has been trying to get back to this
root state, that like what it sounds like to hear speech. I often think about this. Have you seen the Leonard Bernstein lectures, the Harvard lecture, The Unanswered Question? It's a 6-part series.
I love it. Yeah, the Norwegian lectures. I love them. And
exactly.
Actually, it's one of my questions.
Okay, interesting. Well, we already got there.
Yeah.
We done bridged that rhizome. But so I was going to bring up this part in it where he talks about the origin of music, and also I think he dances, it's been a while since I've seen it, but he dances around the origin of speech too. Like, what is the first sound? How did a creature first start to get the idea that you could make a sound and it, convey an idea? But there's something really powerful about like getting to this prelingual state before the sounds we make have meaning, but they still have an effect. You know what I mean? Like a word as an action as opposed to a word as a symbol. That's what this translation seems to me to be trying to do. That's a really interesting little avenue to explore. I can't think of a similar example except from my religious past as a evangelical Christian as a kid. We were supposed to speak in tongues, and I remember I'm eternally grateful for this. I remember, and I believe I may have told you about this in various instances in our conversations, but in the past. But just for the sake of anyone listening, in order to speak in tongues, it's almost like you have to temporarily lobotomize yourself and divorce the movement of your mouth from any meaning. And you just sort of say things as they come to you. I don't know what neurologically happens there, and I've never done any research on this, but I would love to see neurologists scan people when they're speaking in tongues or communing with the Holy Spirit or whatever their denomination calls it, because I think it's probably pretty similar, or maybe an inverse or a converse to what we're talking about, of phonemes as weight-carrying actions, but not necessarily semantic things. Like there might not be meaning, but it still might have an effect. Like a coo, like if I hear ooh, I always feel soothed. I think there's something probably universal about that.
Yeah.
That's a hot take. I'm not sure if I can back that up by anything, but for sure, like ooh is nice,
Mm-hmm. And there is something so natural about glossolalia.
Yes.
It feels almost more natural than speaking my mother tongue. And it definitely feels more natural to me than to speak English. It's a strange thing. There is like this theorist actually who was talking about, because this version of Jabberwocky was, according to the author, is anti-grammatical. So what Artaud was trying to do is to connect to an anti-French or a doppelganger French. Like, and he's been claiming that he's been kind of following a Möbius strip of French leading from meaning to non-meaning, and how both of them were very connected. Because in what I read to you, there are some like consonant clusters and some phonemes that are not often found in French, but not together, but strangely they seem to have come naturally to him, and they come naturally to me. It feels like a form of anti-French. Interesting.
And I wonder, so what I would wonder is, can one do this successfully and unsuccessfully? You know what I mean? Like, can you write it, like, is it I don't want to get too like science-y about this, but is it falsifiable? Like, can you write a bad nonsense French translation of Lewis Carroll? And how would you compare two of them? And which one would get at the essence of it better? You know what I mean? Because like there are always multiple translations. And I think when you're dealing with semantic content, I think it's easier to say, oh, this translation's better. That really gets to the essence of it. But with anti-grammar, how do you get at the anti-essence of something? It's probably just the same problem in reverse. But it's a fascinating thought. It's one of those thoughts that like I have no idea what I'm going to do with it later, but I might do something with it later. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I can't think of a theoretical avenue that I would go down with it, but I can sure think of like experiments I might do with it, like in writing or something.
I feel like you need an operator in a way, because in a sense, the original version of Jabberwocky to me feels like more like Debussy. It's like, it's not completely outside, you can still, it's like mot valise, it's two words smashed together. It's stuff like that. So you can reconstitute, it's like Debussy using the whole tone scale. But with the Artaud version, it's more like Weber. It's like serialism, you know what I mean? And so I can understand why he claimed that the Carroll version was an incomplete version of that thing. It was not crazy enough. And it's like, when you think, for example, when you have to invert something, you need an operator, right? So what is the opposite of one? Is it -1 or is it a fraction? I mean, or 3, for example.
Or 0 or infinity.
Yeah, or
complex.
complex
There are a bunch of
number.
different ways that you can think of the opposite there.
Exactly. And you need an operator for that.
Yeah, that's true. I was also just thinking about this as like, you can take what he did and call that the operator, and then you just switch the operand, right? Like, what would be the same operation performed on the Constitution of the United States?
Yes.
You know what I mean? It certainly wouldn't be a direct translation into French of the Constitution of the United States. It'd be a different thing.
Mm-hmm. But so now we're getting to this idea of a Platonic form, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
some kind of an essence that we could extract and through which we could convert things.
Yes, and I'm aware that there's skepticism about that And I'm aware that like a lot of the thinkers that I love are skeptical about that. To be very honest, I get scared sometimes when I talk about stuff like this too much because I fear slipping into a mind state where I'm not operating anymore and I'm just like wondering what I'm doing instead of actually doing the thing. And that's why I love sort of nonsense exercises like the Jabberwocky and like this is Artaud, you said? I've always your pronunciation is so beautiful and native. It's Artaud, right? That guy?
Yep, Artaud.
Okay, cool. I didn't recognize that at first. But his translation is that kind of exercise. It's like acting like that. It's amazing that he could operate at the same time, both theoretically and actually doing the thing. Because I find personally, for me, it's much, much harder to do the thing when I know what I'm doing. Do you know what I mean? Like I would much rather just do the thing. I think it takes a real talent or genius or something for somebody to be able to operate on both of those dimensions simultaneously. And I find myself, if I dwell too much on concepts like this, I adore dwelling on them. But if I do it too much when I'm writing or when I'm trying to produce something, I become overwhelmed with the weight of the concept. And then I sort of freeze, you know?
Yep.
And I want to be able to operate without knowing what I'm doing. So in that sense, like the human being is the operation that we're looking for here. Like that's kind of why this is interesting, right? Like it's the fact that Artaud, so you take this poem and then you mutate it into something else in French, and between the original and the mutation is Artaud, right? So we actually get the essence of what he is in that translation, or how his mind works.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try this. I actually have a book of Italian poetry upstairs that I've been meaning to translate. And I can't speak Italian, but just, like sit there with Google Translate and go through it and try and get the essence of the poem and see how far off I am, and then read the actual English translations and see what comes out of that.
Yeah, there is something
how far off I am.
Really strange about even the nature of translation. I know, for example, Douglas Hofstadter talked a lot about that. He gave some talks in Köln that are absolutely fascinating in different ways of translating the same piece of art. And actually something that I've not done myself so much, maybe a little bit, but trying to triangulate the essence of a piece of art by reading different translations in different languages. And that's kind of what he was talking about.
Yeah. But I wonder what's going to happen 500 years from now when people look at like the way we interpret contemporary works of art or pop music, even better. Like the meanings we ascribe to it are going to be completely alien to those people. I mean, the odds are non-zero that some like data archaeologist in the 32nd century is going to unearth this podcast and listen to us talking and like just become utterly mystified at the way that we're parsing this stuff. So I wonder what because there are also things that they'll find quite familiar, and I wonder what elements will remain. Like this, certainly they'll hear this discussion about a translation and probably feel familiar. They'll speak a different language. They'll be translating what we say all the time. I just listened to a podcast the other day about hermeneutics, like this notion of figuring out what somebody means in the context of their time and their milieu, and the fact that we often assume we understand somebody and their intent, and that's extremely naive. And like there's just so much anxiety for me with that thought. But what's freeing about this exercise that you just described is like it doesn't matter. I'm just taking the phonemes literally and spitting them back out. That's such a freeing thought.
Yeah, it's something that there is something actually very scary for my mathematical mind, or maybe more system-based mind, to think that every speech, every book is just an exercise in miscommunication.
Yeah, this is what I meant about anxiety with me. Like yes, it's true that we'll never exactly get to the meaning of what somebody else is saying, but I think it's simultaneously true that we'll get to like 99% of the meaning of what they're saying, or like not to think too numerically, but like if somebody says, "Look out, a piano is about to fall on your head," the meaning is pretty clear that a piano is about to fall on my head. If somebody says, "I love you," the meaning is way less clear. And I think most statements are somewhere between, for example, this sentence is somewhere very much between those two. And most anything worth thinking about is somewhere between those two. So I guess that's my point, is I try not to slip into the abyss of doubting my instincts and that I don't know what somebody means because of the action component of words, right? Like, so my words have an effect, and it may be a semantic effect, or it may be just an action phonetic effect, but the effect is real. And someone with an analytical mind could fall off into an abyss of second guessing their meaning all the time. And I think that would be tragic if we all did that.
It's like lyrics are a many-edged sword, and you never know how many edges there are exactly, but you still have to wield it all the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes sense that my religious upbringing is coming up twice in this conversation, because like the interpretation of scripture was my first exposure to logic, basically. Like, okay, we have a statement. What does it mean? And, you hear 5 different people, they'll interpret the same scripture 5 different ways. And that was, I think, something that I've sort of copied into my understanding of language and artistic intention as well. But I think about this all the time. Like, what are the data archaeologists in the 32nd century going to think of the quote unquote content that we're creating? Not necessarily with this, but also with our music and with the videos we upload.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends. But let's say they never get their hands on a Bible, or they never get their hands on Shakespeare, or on Alice in Wonderland, which are the 3 most quoted, most like intertextual resources in the English language. I mean, their interpretation is bound to be very, very different if they don't have these 3 central pieces of interpretations. Because, for example, reading Shakespeare it's just mind-blowing. You just find syntagmas and bits of pieces of things that you see everywhere, like something wicked this way comes, like stuff like that. And in French, it's the same with Le Cid by Corneille. And so it's crazy. If you don't have this, so much goes over your head in a way.
Yeah. And I'm certain we've lost a lot of that with our forebears. Fortunately, something happens where the main text winds up being preserved. The Quran, the memorization of the Quran turned into a ritual, makes it mathematically impossible for the Quran to ever be deleted, because everybody memorizes a little chunk of it. And if you could basically, if you take any random assemblage of 300 or 400 Muslims, you have the Quran right there in their mind.
It's like Fahrenheit 451.
It's literally been 30 years since I read that book. What happens there?
I have to spoil it for you.
Oh, that's fine.
But basically, Montag. I
love Bradbury, but it was literally, I think I was 12 when I read that book.
I mean, he's a fireman who burns books. That's what he does, right? And so at some point, he starts to question his line of work, and he ends up at the end of the book in a community of people that memorize books. They are trying to salvage, and so everybody is memorizing a book or a piece of a book or a bunch of books.
Right. So they're like a living library.
Yes.
Yeah. So this, I actually think about this a lot in terms of user interface. Like, so we right now are making a transition. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I've had the sense for a while. It's sort of encapsulated by the ugly phrase "pivot to video" that a lot of content creation businesses are doing, where they're moving away from text and towards the creation of little video bites. But I do think that's not a creation of capitalism. I think it's a reflection of a movement to visual culture and away from like text on a page. And I think that changes how you think, right? So if you're a verbal culture and you're passing things down verbally, I think it makes certain conclusions easier to reach and certain other conclusions less easy to reach. As opposed to a textual culture, which is static but top down in its view, as opposed to a visual culture or a video culture even. And I have no idea what that is yet. I think none of us do. Like, what is a culture whose primary text is a YouTube video or a 1 hour long, speech by somebody, as opposed to somebody whose primary text is a lump of pages glued together? I think the format matters a lot in that respect. I
agree. I mean, every medium, the medium is the message, right? That would be the strong
clue and represent.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I don't know if I agree that the medium is the message, but at the very least, it seems obvious that every medium comes with a set of constraints and possibilities. That, for example, a book is linear by nature, and it's a solo endeavor. It's something that you do by yourself. Whereas a story, I mean, it's complicated for a book before hypertext to have many versions and expect a book, I don't know, like one of these books, you're the hero of the book. I don't know how it's called in English, but you follow, you do actions. It's like an RPG book.
Choose your own adventure. Yeah, we had those as a kid, but they never got, what's weird to me is they were never taken seriously. It was like a very early example of a hypertext book, but without the need for technology, right? Like turn to page 42 if you want to pull out your sword and fight the monster. Turn to page 47 if you run away. Like, why didn't it catch on as like an adult literary genre? What about that didn't people take seriously?
I don't know, but I think that in a way you have to fight the book, and the reader has to be trusted to fight the book in the proper manner and not to cheat. Because if
right.
if the page you're reading tells you if you have more than 8 arrows in your backpack, go to page blah blah, and if you don't, go to the other page, and it's page 233, and you know that page you've been on there before, you've been reading the whole book, that's where you get eaten by a monster. You just don't want to go to that page.
Yeah. I used to love those books as a kid. The notion of being able to navigate the mage was so fascinating to me. But again, like you read that, you can also, it is not impossible to read them cover to cover, you know? And once I finished the book, I would then read it cover to cover, and it would sort of be like a best of thing. Like, oh, remember when I did that? That was cool. Remember when I did that? That was cool too. And sometimes there would be a passage that I just wouldn't want to go down. Like, I don't want to do that. And I would never read that portion of the book. I would be quite religious about it. So like, I don't want to do that. There'd like be like 20 or 30 pages that I wouldn't be able to see. But like, so you're an archaeologist. You look at one of those books. Like, maybe you discover the rules, maybe you don't. But like, what do you do with like? We just don't know, right? Like, there's no way to know. Either this like culture that we're in right now self-destructs, and we never are able to find out what it does to the human mind, or it initiates like just a different kind of enlightenment, like a second enlightenment. Or it's just more of the same. Maybe we'll still be kind of textual, but have video on top of us. But I get the impression, and I think it's easy to think this about the era you live in, but I get the impression that we're in a transitional phase right now, from text culture to text plus video culture. Maybe we call it hypertext culture. Maybe we call it, I don't know what we call it, but something like that. And I think it's also exciting, but it's important that people maintain. I think it's fine to move media, but you must maintain that sense of rigor that we had in text culture. And this is something that I think maybe since I started teaching again after many years and interacting with younger people in a pedagogical way, I actually relaxed a lot about. Because I used to think like, oh, you know, pivot to video, this is going to be the death of the mind. We're all just going to be playing Xbox forever. But now I'm much more open to the notion that it's just like a differently enabled kind of human discourse, because I've seen people show me thinkers on YouTube, and like I call them thinkers, not just like YouTubers. With there's this is not a great example, I suppose, but there's a guy called the Swedish Investor. Do you know this guy?
Nope.
Okay, so he's not a thinker, but it's like he's a good distiller of thought, right? And there's a certain rigor that comes with the ability to be able to distill somebody's thought and make it clearly expressed. And interacting with younger people who experience content that way instead of just books, just PDFs, just EPUBs, has made me much more optimistic about the future of the intellect. I hope I'm not being naive when I say that, but I don't know. I think we'll still make profound conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a many-sided problem, because the thing is, like, these people you are referring to, for me, it seems, I don't know, my instinct tells me it's going to be a net positive. Because these people, they just don't have to bow before the watchdogs of yore. You know, they just, to get their ideas across, they don't have to do all these gymnastics.
Yep.
So that's a good thing. But these people tend to have a balanced diet of video and textual content.
That's right.
And so maybe the problem is more who comes after that. Because I've felt doing this podcast and being a big consumer of podcasts myself, of course, I love the medium. I think it's absolutely great. But you get into what Kahneman called this, what you see is all there is fallacy. I mean, the amount of podcasts that's out there is just nothing compared to the amount that could be out there. And so many interesting people are left out, because actually to be part of that whole movement, you need to have audiovisual abilities that a lot of super interesting people are not attracted to, or don't have, or are not actively trying to get to. And
right.
so much is lost, so much. I mean, especially in like academia and stuff, I've been reading papers for the podcast that I could never have got to had I not started the podcast, because I had to mail their authors, having got like a bit of something somewhere, to ask them.
Oh, amazing.
Yes. And so there is so much that cannot be accessed through this passive soaking of podcast content, which is also great. You know, I don't want to, but it's like there's a local minima and a local maxima, and you know what I mean.
Absolutely. I share your optimism, though, and I think that it's easy to assume that that rigor is impossible in a medium that encourages you to scan and encourages you, like you said at the beginning, to increase the speed of the text or decrease it or whatever. But it's not necessarily that way. I think we can be open-minded about where the profundity comes from, where the rigor comes from. But it has to be people who are willing to give something a lot of time and give it depth and give it concentration. I do think concentration is probably a universal good, and any medium has its own liabilities for distraction. I still read books, and I think I will always read books. What I think is good, like I'm in my, I don't know how you slice it, but I call it early middle age. I'm turning 41 tomorrow. Actually, tomorrow's my birthday, and
Okay.
I pride myself as being a middle-aged person who makes a lot of effort to be humble about how much I don't know, because I think that's what differentiates youth from middle age, is like this belief that like, oh, I've been around the block a time or two, kid. I don't have that in me. I don't think I can say that, because like I know things. I know a lot of things. I'm proud of the things I know, but I think it's extremely naive to think that I know more than young people because of my age. And I think I wish more middle-aged people kept that thought in the forefront, because the notion is like, you give a lot away with your age, but what you get in return is experience. And while that's true, I think maybe we overvalue it a little bit. I guess my point here is that when you're aging, your mind has a tendency to like bias the content that you were exposed to and the formats that you were exposed to, and you miss out on so much wisdom. And I'm really grateful to have met, for example, people like you, who have shown me things that I wouldn't have seen if I wasn't willing to, be shown new things. Young people can't be shown. There are plenty of young people who have that naivety as well. They're like, oh, I know, you're just dumb. Like you other people who have other ideas than me. Like there are plenty of young people. It's not necessarily an age thing. But I do think it's important for people of all ages to be like really, really willing to have a truck driven into their pre-existing biases and have their eyes open, because we can all learn something, and we can all have our perspective just massively altered every couple of months or so if we're lucky. And it's immensely exciting to do that too.
Tell me if you agree with this, but I feel like the equation is that, in a sense, you and me are both curious people. I think it's a fair thing to say. But I feel like there is, I don't know how to formulate that, but there is a fundamental asymmetry between the teacher and the student, in the sense that the teacher is a bit like the obstetrician and the student is like the future mother giving birth, in the sense that when you get into a mentor-pupil relationship, the mentor essentially tells you the way who you are now is not conducive to accomplishing your goals. You're going to need to kill the person you're now and to change, and some pain is going to be involved. And the student does that more or less well, depending on the degree to which he trusts the mentor and to which he feels in himself this need, and he has acknowledged the need to get to a better state, like a caterpillar has to turn into a chrysalid or a chrysalis before it turns into a butterfly. And so I feel like the more you age, the more you want to believe that you're a butterfly, and paradoxically, the more painful, the more you just don't want to recognize that. Your pain, your curiosity has to be stronger than your pain. That's kind of the equation.
Right. I love this metaphor of the obstetrician, because if you think about a male obstetrician, he'll never know how to give birth. Like his job is to guide people through giving birth and to make sure that people aren't hurt, but he has no idea what it's like, but he can still serve as, if he's humble and if he listens to his patients, he can still provide immense value to them. I don't want to make too much hay out of humility. I think that pride is good too. But I guess my point is, if he is aware of who he is and doesn't pretend that he is something else, then he's able to maximize his effect on people. I guess his goal in that case would be, making people have birth in a way that maximizes the health of the child and the mother. But to use a caterpillar analogy, like, yeah, it is fine that we all don't wind up knowing how to like pour a magic serum on everybody and make them all butterflies. Like, I think it's much more valuable as somebody who's like moving into being and you're making this transition now too, by the way. So since you have a podcast, even in its early stages, like you now become somebody who people will think like, oh, that guy knows what's up, and like at some point, you will have to go like, actually, I don't know what's up at all. And even someone like you, even when someone who's curious and intellectually honest, like you're gonna at some point be like, you're gonna hit this realization, like, oh my God, I have no idea.
No, I mean, I'm in it right now. It's everyday works, and I think the Bible says it. There's a verse that says, "To increase one's knowledge is to increase one's suffering." I just wish for things to be simple, but I'm just always realizing that no, it's just not simple. Yeah. And I just want to get to the simplest explanation that is not a reduction, and it's just too complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. But the process is so. I guess that's what I don't want to miss out on. It's like that's why I don't want to overemphasize humility. Is that the whole thing is just damn fun. In a sense, it's kind of disappointing that I don't feel like I look at other adults, and this is maybe something that I'll be embarrassed that I said in a few years. But I look at other adults and I feel sad because I see people who have lost the ability to like allow themselves to be clueless, to allow themselves to not know something, like to be like dazzled by a new concept. And I hope I never do that. I hope I get killed before that happens to me. Or if I do that, then I hope I know that I've done it and I'm just like, whatever, I'm old. Give me some steak. You know, like I hope I'm a good grumpy old person who knows that his time is done and doesn't think that like, you know.
So you think that the part of yourself that tells you that wants to reduce everything and that tells you, nah, these people are nuts, or now this doesn't make sense, that thing is going to get the better of you at some point? That part?
I think it'll get the better. I think it probably already has. Yeah, I don't know the ways in which it has. I think for sure with politics it has, because like for example, I see a lot of younger people like gleefully embracing. I don't know what the right word is for it even, but like the word people used to use a few years ago was alt-right concepts, but like just these notions of like libertarian, we're all in it for ourselves, you know, rutting in the glorious evils of self-interested capitalism. And I've had to like realize that like these priors that I'm bringing to the table, which is based on the worldview that was cool when I was young, probably seem old-fashioned to people. And I think that's something that I'll never be able to get rid of. Like I'm never going to be able to think that. That doesn't mean that I'm right, but like I think that's where the humility comes in, right? It's like not only thinking that like it's good for me to be open-minded, but knowing where my limit is and knowing that I can't be open-minded on some things. And, you know, as a result, what does that change? Well, not much. If somebody says something that I don't like, I'm still going to bite their head off. But like, it at least allows me to take a step or two back from the situation, thinking, well, to what extent is my prior biasing me here? And also, to link it a second ago, I don't think everything has to link together, but like to what you started a second ago, do I really know what they mean? You know what I mean? When they're talking about this, when they're like glorying in, for example, the SoundCloud rap fascination with like nihilistic wasting of money. Like I don't, for me, it's nihilistic wasting of money, but I think there's something really human in it somewhere. And I've missed it because I don't know the language and I don't know what it's like in their head. I don't know what those phonemes sound like when they hit their ears. I mean, it's sad to me that I don't know that, but it's also kind of exciting. It's like, oh, there's this whole other world of conscious experience of art that I'll never quite get. I do think a lot of that stuff is just objectively garbage. And I believe in like objective truth and reality in a way that's probably not very easy to defend, but it's something I won't give up. Like cigarettes. But I do think it's very important to dope that crystal with the notion of like, I just don't know. And maybe there's something profound there. Like profundity can come from all corners.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, we're getting to the notion of meta-honesty, because there is something that you know you cannot be honest about, and you're just honest about the fact that this thing you cannot.
Yeah,
because
Zizek would love that thought. He loves that stuff.
I'm not so aware of his philosophy.
I'm not either, frankly, but it's the kind of thing where he's like, yeah, we all have, like, one of his thoughts would be like, you know, I'm grumpy and I have a right to be grumpy. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm wrong, and damn it, it's my right to be wrong.
I mean, in a way, it's also the dark side of self-actualization, because you know when you're a kid and you're just out and you're just pure potential, you can become a knight, you can become a priest in ancient Egypt. You have the potential to become a freestyler or whatever, and so you have all this potential. Whatever way out of the myriads of different ways that you can choose to realize this potential, you're gonna shut some doors, And there is just no way to do it, to concretize that thing without closing some doors. And so I guess you need to be honest about that, about the fact that there are some things that you are just closing the door on that you're just never going to get. You just cannot get it.
The visual metaphor that's always helped me with that, because that thought, what did Kierkegaard call that? It was like the paralysis of the finite and paralysis of the infinite were the two things that he thought about. The paralysis of the finite is people who are like trapped in their day-to-day world and they don't see a way out. The paralysis of the infinite is people who are like overwhelmed by what to do. And maybe anxiety of the infinite. I'm not saying the phrase correctly, but it's definitely from Kierkegaard, this thought that like some people they have choice paralysis. And something that's always made me feel better about that is this visual metaphor of a glider. Like we have this notion, especially in our societies, that we are what we make ourselves, right? You know, like you just gotta build that airplane and take it off and fly it around. But I've always thought that it's a more realistic notion that we're gliders and we have a finite amount of fuel in like a small engine. And as we're plummeting back down to Earth, we can move, we can navigate, we can turn. But every time we make a turn, it has a cost of which direction we move in. It lowers our velocity and or it brings us closer to the ground. It does one of those two things. It's a trade-off. And eventually we hit the ground, but like there's so much freedom, even though we're plummeting, there's a lot of freedom in like how you move around as you're gliding. It's not maybe ideal or the most cheerful thought, but that has helped me get over those like choice fear before of like, oh, if I do this, then I cannot do this. That's true in a lot of cases, but what are you going to do, as they say in Brooklyn? What are you going to do?
How does the idea of teaching fits into all of this? Because I told you I was going to quote Bernstein, and he said actually about teachers something along the lines of, when I teach, I learn, and when I learn, I teach. And this podcast is a way of leveraging my teaching myself in different ways. I'm trying to like bring something to other people in a way. But you teach students, and I'm curious to know how you feel about teaching. Are you teaching yourself at the same time? And how different situations do you feel influence the way a teaching is done or not?
Yeah. Well, so I'm also in a program that studies education at the meta level. Like, what is education? What does it do? We write a lot about what good teaching practice is, and philosophically what teaching does. And I've always thought, I think I may have told you on a couple of occasions, but when I wasn't teaching, I was having dreams about it. So I think there's something in me that wants to teach. But I also think it's like, because when I first graduated college, I was 20 or 21, and I immediately went into teaching high school chemistry, because I had a degree in physics, and back home where I was from, they needed a stand-in chemistry teacher. So I just jumped in, and something gravitated to me about that, of like, I think it was Richard Feynman who expressed this. I'll paraphrase, but if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it well. Another great example, by the way, of somebody who might be a bit of a jerk, but like is also truly brilliant, Richard Feynman. Anyway, I thought I really took that to heart, and I also found it to be true when I was trying to, because like I was a physics major, I wasn't a chemistry major, so I was having to reteach myself some of these things as I was teaching them, and I was realizing like if somebody asked me a question and I couldn't really explain it, then at root there was a misunderstanding on my part as well. So I knew that there was a symbiotic relationship very early on in my life between teaching and understanding. I think part of it is an urge that we all get over time, and it develops as you age, to give back and like establish a beachhead, because like there are things you get to do and there are things you don't get to do, and you realize the older you get that it's quite random. But what you want to do is create a condition for other people like you to be able to make it as far as they can. I think most people probably have that urge to some degree. That must be hardwired into us evolutionarily to want our forebears to succeed in ways that we haven't. But much more than that, because I don't really see myself as primarily a teacher. I see myself as somebody who teaches just because it's an urge that I have to do. But I'm not done. You know what I mean? And I think it's every bit as likely that like you'll find my students pining away on some piece of work as you will me at 5 a.m. or 2 a.m. or 10 a.m. or whatever. And I find myself invigorated to do better in my own work, and also find myself deepening my own work as a result of the teaching. So I don't differentiate it. It's just something that I wound up needing to do. I think it's probably a question for like a psychologist why I wound up doing that. But for sure, there's crosstalk between developing new skills and teaching students new skills. Like, you know what's crazy is teaching mixing. And I don't currently teach any mixing classes per se, but I do teach some classes in which students have very little experience mixing. Like by this I mean like taking audio signals and putting them together in a way where the ear can understand them and they sound good. And something like that is one of those things where you can teach somebody all these tricks, you can teach them all these things that work, and then they come up with something that you would have never thought of that doesn't qualify as any of those tricks. It's not conventional wisdom, and it's stunningly beautiful. And you put that in your quill when you see somebody use that. You take something from your students all the time as a teacher. And with mixing especially, because mixing is one of these things, one of these gestalt things. It's like greater than the sum of its parts. Any mix is that way. And it's just an exposure to other people's way of doing things. It's also a gesture of trust when a student shows you their work and they're letting you in a way that people usually don't get to come in to an artist's work. And I just take those moments really seriously. And here's what I don't understand: an artist who doesn't want to teach. Because like you're taking yourself out of a conversation there. Like every artist is a teacher to some degree. And maybe the other, and I don't want to do this like John Lennon on Saturday Night Live, and the converse is true too. Every teacher is an artist, but like in a sense, I think it is very true that every artist is engaging in what might be considered pedagogical discourse with society, and individually, one-on-one, you're doing that with people as a teacher as well. I don't think my life would be nearly as rich if I weren't teaching right now. I'm very grateful for that kind of interaction, and I don't know how to conceive of myself without it anymore, frankly.
At the same time, there seems to be some kind of something paradoxical somewhere about teaching art or teaching someone to find their inner voice or what's unique about them.
Well, there's I'll interject forcefully here. I think there's something paradoxical about evaluating it. I very much think there's something paradoxical about, for example, assigning a number grade to a creative assignment. That's weird.
Absolutely.
And by weird, I mean dumb.
Yeah.
And you can quote me on that. And there are a lot of people who would back me up as well. I'm not just some idiot saying that. Like, it's the notion of assigning and assessing value in a quantitative way on a work of art is boorish.
Well, let me pick your brains about something then.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have said, I read somewhere on Twitter that you posted that the way artists were incentivized, I mean, if we incentivize engineers the way we incentivize artists, bridges would fall down and people would die everywhere. Because artists, yeah. And
I think
it's pretty true.
Yeah.
But then I was thinking some more, and there was somebody in the comments who was kind of pushing back and was telling you, so how should we incentivize artists without creating like a grand committee to grade art and stuff like that? And I thought that, well, artists have always been put through the ages, and you're the one who made me read Noises, have always been put.
Ali.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of Atali, actually. I think I read some of his other books. I think it's the only good one that I've read, but yeah, anyways. And so artists have always been under pressures. And I was thinking, is it not a definitory or a defining characteristic of art to be something that cannot be properly incentivized?
Maybe. That's a good, that is a proposition worthy of examining. I would say, off the top of my head, that the whole category of art, as you and I have been using it here, is precisely one of those words that data archaeologists in the year 3320 would be very confused about. Because this notion of an artist as like a profession is, unless I'm very mistaken, quite recent. Like, there were artisans, there were people who made things, but this notion of art as a spiritual practice is something that probably emerged in Romanticism or maybe even modernism, as like an artist as a shaman. We've been able to incentivize religion and people who engender ecstatic states in people. I think the issue, it's not so much about incentivizing good art, it's about enabling good art to exist via some kind of patronage system, or like a scholastic, not council, but like a system in which artists don't have to suffer and die. Oh, it's called socialism. Like, it's the notion that like a human being should have the right to take risks on how they live their life and not die as a result. I think that's all, when I say a statement like that, that's all I'm asking for. But what I think that conversation, if I remember correctly, the thing that triggered it was the notion that there's so much bad art that is lionized. And this is where I'll go back to my objectivist foxhole, not in Ayn Rand sense, but in the Aristotelian sense of there is stuff and some of it's good and some of it's bad. And I know I can't defend that philosophically, but man, the kind of art that people consume, generally speaking, is of little value. And those people have a lot of money. And all I'm asking for is a system in which a small percentage of those people's largesse can be distributed to artists who are taking risks and trying to do weird, edifying, beautiful things, as opposed to just taking it to the bank. But again, it's the category of art, I think, that's the problem here, because we're talking about entertainers, and I'm conflating entertainment with art when I'm talking like this. I'm talking about Nashville country music stars who make tens of millions of dollars a year compared to singer-songwriters who are struggling and will never make a dime and die before they see a dime, and they're making great work that we'll never hear. It's that injustice that I'm trying to address, and also an injustice of, because once we get past the resource distribution problem, it's like, okay, cool, everybody's not going to die. But also the media infrastructure is going to blast out bad content. Most people are going to listen to that bad content, and good content is still going to be disincentivized for dissemination. I don't have an answer to that right now, but I certainly think the way we do it right now is not the best way to do it.
Can you tell me a little bit about the label you're working on?
Yeah, this Dreams of Field Recordings thing. So Christian and I, it's a guy in a band called the Hotel Year. They're a fairly popular emo band in the post-emo scene in America. And my music project, Emperor X, got together. Our record label basically fell apart because there was some accounting irregularities, and people lost confidence in the people, some of the people who were running the label. It wasn't fraud, or it wasn't people trying to take advantage of musicians. It wasn't anything hideous, but it was just, bad accounting. And so basically the label fell apart, and Christian and I were in a position where we were like, what are we going to do now? Let's look at some alternative economic models that might make sense for us to work together. So all a record label does is pool resources of artists and then use that money pool to absorb the risk of putting out other artists who might not sell much, but who might be doing good work. That's all record labels do. And we just kind of wanted to continue that Moneyball idea, but have the people making the decisions be artists instead of people whose full-time job it was to do A&R. So I don't think that's actually going to solve the problem, really. I think that's just a survival mechanism for now. The larger problem is, in my opinion, just the fire hose of, man, I really don't want to come across as judgmental here, but just the fire hose of bad music that most people fill their lives with. And I don't mind saying that. Are you familiar with the term poptimism?
No.
So in the earlier mid-O's, there was a blog called Pitchfork. They're still around, obviously. They're one of the more prominent music websites on the internet still. But they, in the mid-O's or so, they started covering not just independent artists, but they also started covering top 40 artists. And this was loosely characterized as poptimism, this notion that you're a snob if you don't like top 40 music. You're a snob if you think that just independent artists are capable of profundity. That's, of course, true. There's been some amazing top 40 music that's come out in the past couple of years, and the indie scene has been pretty garbage, actually. So to some extent, the poptimists were right. But now we're in a really bad position because the music infrastructure for small independent artists is shriveling. And what we have left are these huge gatekeepers. And if you don't get picked up by one of these gatekeepers, you're just going to be on mute forever because everyone only listens to things that are in the musical noosphere. I actually want to bring up a TikTok as an example. So do you have TikTok?
No, I don't. I'm too old already.
Okay. So I don't know if it's still this way, but when it first came out, you'd be able to pick from a bunch of songs that were licensed by TikTok and then do your lip sync video to them, right? Cool, cute, harmless idea. Not going to tick off any licensing people. But look at the consequence. You have music, and the music that you can lip sync to is limited by what is in the large but finite database of music that's been published. And I think people generally work that way. There's real music, which is music that that is put out by very large major labels that have ad campaigns. And then there's like what your brother puts out, or the guy down the street. And they're very different things. Of course, that's changing. Of course, we have like Patreon to fund independent artists. And I know that there are tools that people can use, but I'm not convinced that we're really incentivizing the creation of, I think we're disincentivizing. Oh, no, I can't say that. I know that we're incentivizing the creation of PAP, of content that isn't like really interesting.
I think it's an instance of the Shirky principle. I don't know if you heard of the Shirky principle.
No, this is
but
new
it's,
to me.
But it's this idea that an industry that fights some phenomenon will try to preserve the phenomenon if it tends to disappear in other ways, and will do its best to defend it. So an example is the company in the US, TurboTax, which autofills your tax returns.
Who they ate the IRS online filing system. Absolutely.
Yes, and they basically lobbied the IRS so they don't autofill the things themselves, because that would put them out of a job, right? and so I could give countless examples of that. There are many. Yeah. I mean, taxis versus Ubers for bad or for good. That's how it happened. But so in that case,
great point.
It's another question I had written down, because back in the day we had a lot of music critics and not that much music. And now, in a way, I'm thinking, should we write music about articles? Because now it's the opposite. Not that, you know what I mean? Not that many people write articles, but many people make music. And actually, I listened to another podcast that you did a few years ago, and you said I think you were very right to say that, but that before, the top 5% of the population at most had access to a recording studio. So there was very high barriers to entry, like not everybody could record music. But now that everybody can record music, the music industry has to defend itself against just the onslaught of music that comes from a decentralized perspective. And so they have to create a narrative or a way to, because I have a feeling, I don't want to be seen as an elitist, but as a musician, I have this feeling of, actually, no, music is it's not objective, quality is not objective, but it's very intersubjective. Like, people tend to agree a lot on what is good and what is not.
Intersubjective is a good word.
The human experience tend to be unified in a myriad ways that we cannot even grasp, because something like, even though that's all a big exercise in miscommunication, we can still touch and move each other very deeply for some weird reason. And so the fact that everything is a form of, if I'm an elitist, I'm fighting back against musical nihilism, because everything is not worth the same.
Yes.
And also, we've also lost sight of something. To be honest, I don't even know if we ever had it in sight, but you can make music that will be successful over the next 5 months, but you can also try to make music that is going to last a bit longer than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, or you can be a real, you can be a real musician and make music without even thinking about it. I've never done that. No one I know has ever done that, but there are musicians out there who make music because it should exist, and they don't even think about who the audience is. I admire people like that. That takes a kind of saintly detachment that I and everyone I've ever met lack, but there are those people and they make brilliant things.
Yeah.
But back to what you said a second ago about this notion about 5% of the population at most, whereas opposed to now, almost everybody can. We've been through this process before. The invention of the printing press, right? Before we had illiterate peasants, very few could read. And now all you need is a ballpoint pen and a piece of paper, and you can write poetry. All you need is a Xerox copier, and you can print a chapbook. I don't think that we've seen a plummet in the quality of writing. Maybe there are people who care a lot more about writing than I do who would disagree with me. Certainly not on the hundreds of year scale. Maybe you can make an argument that the novel has its golden ages and dark ages. It goes back forth over decades. Maybe people can say journalism has its golden ages and dark ages. But I think our ability as a species to create compelling fiction and poetry, I don't think it's any worse than it was 400 years ago. And I wonder how we made that transition, because that's precisely the transition we're going through with music. I think there's still going to be good work and bad work made that gets popular, but it's going to be a lot more dependent on how empowered individuals are to spend time and take risks and not worry about the audience and say, audience be damned, I'm just going to do a thing and see if it sticks or not. Ever since I was a kid, actually, I think the reason I started recording was this notion of what happens to my voice when I'm dead. Like I got a 4-track with my dad when I was I don't know 13 or 14 or something, a cassette 4-track, and I was just fascinated, always have been, and in this conversation has come up several times, fascinated with the notion of what we leave behind, what an archaeologist discovers of our existence. And I think maybe it's an optimistic view, but I think if you trust people to you train people to do something well, and then you trust them with infinite time and infinite freedom, then I think they tend to come up with really profound, beautiful things. Of what worth are those profound, beautiful things? I don't know, and I don't claim to be able to justify that, but this idea is thrilling to me, that we can empower individuals to make beautiful things and divorce it from having to sell them or having to convince the market that they're needed. Do you know what I mean? Like liberating an individual from having to sell the work they make frees them to make whatever insane concept hits them like a truck at any point in the day. I know that this is idealistic, and I know that taken to its extreme, it is naive. But
I mean, it's back to the incentives we were talking about.
Exactly.
Because every incentive is going to skew the work you're gonna build,
mm-hmm.
and it's something you're gonna need to think about every step of the way. It's like a logic you will never be able to escape, and you have to compose with it.
Yep. This is why I love reading about the lives of musicians that I admire. The further back in time I can go, the better. But just, going back to this discovery thing, like we really don't know much about music prior to the church, prior to the, I guess, 11th century. We really don't know much about what it actually sounded like. There were composers. They probably didn't have the notion that their music could survive them. But there were people who played music, and that was improvisational. And I don't think that music was entirely improvisational back then. I can't imagine that. It's a fascinating thought, what those people thought about.
Thinking about archaeologists, I wonder how an archaeologist finding a guitar would retro-engineer how that thing was used. Because
or an OP1.
Yeah. You're talking about the teenage engineering synth.
Yeah, exactly. You see this, what the hell is this? This can't be a musical device. This must have been used for a spacecraft.
Yeah. Although I must say that some part of me, I don't know. I mean, there is no way of knowing if that's right or wrong, but I'm a bit pessimistic about this whole archaeology thing because we've entered in the age of undying information. And so I feel like as soon as we started to make time capsules, to bury time capsules for people to unearth centuries or millennia later, we've become self-conscious of this it means that we've become self-conscious of this very possibility of us being the subject of a future archaeologist. And so it's a self-destroying prophecy.
Yeah, because then authenticity becomes impossible.
Yes. I mean, because we are aware of it on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's because it's a Brave New World scenario where it's just a sea of information. What's interesting with archaeology is that it's so hard to find signal.
Right, exactly.
And now it's just everywhere, everything is signal. And so it's noise. I mean, so maybe for sure, the archaeologists of tomorrow are data scientists and are people that find a way to aggregate the data in new, interesting ways.
Right. I'm sure somewhere in China, this we're also speaking on Zoom right now. This is being recorded, and somebody says let's find videos of everyone with a blue shirt in between the year 2008 and 2027, and picking out signals from that mess is going to be important. But I see your point, though. I actually take this on board in a pretty serious way. That if you're making music for the future, you're not making music for now. If you're making music for people who are eventually going to hear you, you're not really making music for the people that are alive today either. And it sort of removes you from that conversation that we were talking about earlier, this give and take. Because as a performer, it's like we were talking about artists being teachers. As a performer, you're also a teacher. You're leading people along and saying this is what we should all do together right now. And if you're always thinking about what it's going to look like on Instagram, you're keeping yourself circumscribed. There are things you won't do that you would be less afraid to do if you weren't thinking about it, just abandoning yourself to the moment. And that ecstatic abandon is also a really important concept to me. I find myself split often between these notions of what's left behind, what theoretically is the right thing to support, what should I do, as opposed to in the moment, just this exciting, I've described it as a feeling like somebody is like a plant is growing out of your chest, and it's like a vine that just keeps sprouting. That kind of excitement And I feel excitement about both of those things, both the like logical operation part of analyzing what ought to be done, and also the ecstatic explosion of what needs to happen in the moment. And I wouldn't even call it attention, but I would call it like, two orthogonal vectors that don't necessarily harm one another, but they can distract. And that's been the trick for me my whole life, how much attention to pay to either. Because you do have a finite amount of energy, right? Like, do I want to know exactly what the right format is and what music should be like right now, theoretically, philosophically? Or do I just want to go play a show and shout at people because it feels good,
I just want to point something out, is that we are going through my questions that I wrote down without me having even the need to read them. Because, yeah, it's
I knew we
crazy.
both predicted that might happen, actually.
Yeah, it's like I'm oozing my questions. I mean, I don't know what's happening, but I wrote, how does one explore a functionally infinite landscape of knowledge and experiences?
Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
That's pretty much it. But it's definitely a big quandary. How deep, how broad, how everything, because of course, the more curious you are. And there's also like this problem with curiosity, is that you just set out to do all these things that you can never do. You can do 1% of them. And so there is like, maybe it's a dark side of curiosity, is that you are, I mean, at least for me, is that you are deluding yourself in some way, that you just want to do all these things. And then, to do an Alice in Wonderland metaphor, there is just a point at which some heads have to fall. You have to pick, you just cannot keep that many things.
Yeah, it's something that I think every era of humanity, every human being who's alive has dealt with. I'm thinking of 3 references to this right now. One is this Kierkegaardian concept we talked about before of being paralyzed by the infinite. The other is a Devo song called Freedom of Choice, which makes a reference to, this may be apocryphal, I don't know, I've never actually listened for this ancient Roman poem that Devo references, but the idea is that there's a poem about, I'll just quote the line, there was a poem about a dog who found 2 bones, he sniffed a one, he licked the other, he ran in circles, and he dropped dead. It's a good song. Do you know it? Are you familiar with this song?
No, I'm not, but that reminds me of a very old parable of the donkey of Buridan in French. It's super famous.
I don't know it.
It's a story of a donkey, and the donkey is like equally thirsty and hungry. And this guy actually, Buridanus, the guy who came up with the parable, did some super interesting pre-Newtonian things to try to figure out gravity and stuff like that. But the only thing he's remembered for is this donkey that did not know if he should drink or eat first and just drop dead.
All right, so yeah, this is definitely something that seems to reappear throughout culture. And I think at the root of it is at the root of choice is will, and whether or not we have it, right? Like whether or not free will exists, we certainly think we have it. That much is certain. And as somebody who's in love with the notion of free will, that is what I focus on. I don't focus on whether or not we actually have free will. I focus on the fact that we think we do.
Yeah, how useful thinking that you have it can be.
Exactly. And furthermore, just reminding yourself like, well, you have to choose. Like the universe isn't going to do it for you. Or if it does, that's also a choice. Like you're also choosing to not choose and taking your foot off the gas and letting the car slow down or careen into the bridge. Like,
yeah, it's like the basic ethical dilemma, where inaction is a choice. Are you going to run over the 4 people, or are you going to push the fat guy on the rails? Yeah.
And this is how I deal with the infinite landscape problem that you describe. Is like this is where instinct is really good. I love questioning instinct. I think instinct is dangerous to lionize. But when you have a situation where you just can't have enough information, you have no other choice. You have to do it. I'm reminded of this, the end of the Tractatus. I'll paraphrase it, but this Wittgenstein quote. Yeah. So he's talking about knowledge.
You read that? You read the whole thing?
Oh, God, no. God, no. I am a skimmer, my friend. There are a lot of books that I know very well that I've never read the entirety of.
I mean, I would rather be reading the Digits of Pi for 100 pages than. No, I'm exaggerating. But, yeah, that is one obscure and abstruse piece of work for sure.
Indeed, but the end isn't. Because maybe it's not the very last one, but one of the last little aphorisms is that about which we can say nothing, we must be silent. And he's speaking about knowledge, but I've always sort of ported that over into action. Like that about which we can't know if we're right, we just got to do anyway. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you just have to hold your nose and jump. It's kind of the inverse of what Wittgenstein offered. Like, I think if you took his advice seriously, you'd say like that about which we can't know anything, you just can't do. But I'm more like advocating for the position of if you can't know, but you just have an instinct like, well, I want to do this. What are the consequences? I can't do this other thing. How do I decide? What do I feel like? Just do it. That's the most useless thing anyone can say, but I also think it's been a good guide for me.
Yeah, but just to defend this idea for a second, I feel like in action, there is like an ineffable but really real performative value, because it's just based on this idea that we have, that if you sit there long enough and you just compute all the possibilities, you're going to be able to make an enlightened choice. And it's just not the case.
That's
Sometimes, right. I mean, chess is already very complicated. Maybe some chess masters or grandmasters can think 8 turns in advance, but life has many more degrees of freedom. And so, like, some things you just need to realize them to be able to think a little bit more clearly about them.
That's true. But I also tend to give myself a little bit of a gift when I think about these sorts of things. You mentioned chess, and I played as a kid. I'm probably really bad now, but I used to be decent. And fought an old friend to a standstill recently, actually. And when I was in America recently, we used to play when we were kids, and he still plays, and I fought him to a standstill. So I still got something in me. Anyway, chess is a captivating game to the human mind because I think it seems like a metaphor. There's like this classical deterministic notion of the universe as a clock, and we're all in it, and we move around. And then there's this, statistical mindset of like, well, it's not classical, but it is statistical, and it's not deterministic, but it is probabilistic. And I let myself out of that. So like you say the main difference between, you didn't say this, but I infer from what you say that the main difference between life and chess is that there are more degrees of freedom. But I would say that there's another difference too, is that it's not even gridded like chess. I think, at least the thing that I let myself believe when I'm thinking chessy is that it's not chess, is that it's much more like there aren't discrete units of there aren't boxes. It's like that there's infinite variance and like an infinity of possibility, and I don't have to like decide something that's going to affect my game, right? Like the game is a way of looking at this position that we're in, but like it's only a method, it's only a lens. And like really, if I took that move, there is no perfect move. I guess that's my point. Like theoretically, I could calculate forever, but it's an unsolvable problem. I think in game theory, there's this notion of a solved or a closed game, a game that has a solution, that has a finite set of moves, and this is the correct right move to make. And then there's a kind of game that doesn't have, like tic-tac-toe is a perfect example of that. There's a right way to play that to win. You go first. And there are some games that are not, they don't have they're open solutions. And I let myself believe that life is the latter because we don't know. And why believe the opposite? I think it frees one from the anxiety of choice, and it allows you to just like trust the development of your life as you go about it. I also think it works for music too. Like if you say like, I'm going to write a song, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end, as opposed to through composing, like this notion of, okay, so sometimes sonata form's great, but sometimes you want to break it. Sometimes you just feel the urge to break it. And I think that's extremely important to be able to do, and let yourself see that the sonata form or the chess game is only a useful lens for assembling meaning. And sometimes you can assemble meaning without it. And when that's possible, grab it and run. Like I would have never, for example, thought that I would have been teaching again, but I saw the opportunity. I was like, ooh, that's cool. Grab, run. And it has been extremely fruitful.
Yeah. I mean, I just compared life to a game of chess, but I'm very wary of these comparisons myself. Because as we said, first of all, the unknown unknowns are just uncomputable. So that's one thing already that just destroys the whole validity of modelization. But there is something else, and that's where maybe my lack of mathematical knowledge, because I know that degrees of freedom has a mathematical definition. So my lack of knowledge about that transpires. But I mean, I feel like in chess, one big difference is that beyond the degrees of freedom is that you don't have meta rules. Rules are fixed, and you know them, and they don't change. That's not how life is played. Like if we play life, and if life is a game, there are meta rules on different like levels, even in meta rules to infinity maybe, and the game is constantly changing.
Yeah, it's really fun to think about it that way, actually. It's kind of thrilling, right? Like, we don't know what the rules are. They change all the time. And you can either allow yourself to despair about this, or you can embrace the like thrilling notion of being able to invent a billion versions of your own game as long as your time lasts.
Yeah, it's the glass half full, because maybe a bad move that you played before will become a genius move in the next iteration of the system.
Exactly. But I'm very careful to not disparage people who take the other view, because I think this is as I mentioned before, the whole objective truth about like, what's good and what's bad and all that, I think that's absolutely useless when we talk about like ways of looking at life. Because I think we all have very different methods of interacting with the world. And I would never deign to claim, I would, not only would I never deign to claim, but I'm also extremely suspicious of anyone else who claims that they've got like, just do this. Then you're good. Just look at the world this way. Trust me. Like, no, you, sir, I do not trust. The guy next to you who's doubting himself, him I trust.
Yeah, but in a way, and we were touching a little bit on politics before, and I know you're very involved with this. And I listened to your track, Sad React, that I really liked, by the way. And that's a pretty strong statement.
Yep.
Can you maybe tell people a little bit about that? And I mean, I heard some things in the track. I don't know exactly if that's what you meant, but it definitely hit me on some level. So I'd love to talk about that.
We can link to it in the show notes below, I guess.
Yeah, it will be done.
Cool. So that was, I think I remember how it was composed, but it was just this, I didn't like the idea of these emojis that we've been given to like put our emotions into one of 7 or 8 categories. And I particularly didn't like them when we had a world that we're living in that is in some ways getting better all the time, but in some ways getting more and more precarious and evil all the time too. And the idea that like clicking a sad face is even anywhere near close to an appropriate human response to some of the horrendous things that happen in our world just really bothered me. And it came out of like the shattering of norms that sort of really took off in 2015 or so, right around the time that Brexit started rolling, but since the election of Donald Trump and the emergence of fuck you populism as like the watchword of the day, people that just like enjoy watching things burn. And I saw that people a lot like me were reacting to, and myself included, by the way, obviously, were reacting to these things like, that's outrageous. Send. And it acts as like an appendix of like absorbing all this negative emotion, and then we don't actually do anything. We just like keep going around. So the track is about like, in a lot of ways, what happens when you try to like just keep going and pretending that everything's normal. Because it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And then at some point, spoiler alert, the track ends with the line listing a bunch of bad things that happen, sad react. Bad thing happens, sad react. And then they turn off the internet is the last line of the song. And then they turn off the internet and then it cuts off. Because then you can't sad react anymore. There's nothing to react on. This was by design that the song cuts off like that. And then you have to face, you're sitting there in a room then, and you have to face that you're not on the internet. You're not on a 2-dimensional screen in front of you. You're like actually in a room alone, probably with some blue light on, maybe with headphones on. Maybe your foot fell asleep because you're staring at the computer for too long. That happens to me all the time. And it's not a judgmental track. It's a track to myself. Like we're just stuck. And I have no idea what the solution is. But it feels really good to make art that complains about it. I'm joking a bit, but I genuinely think that that's not nothing. I think that's better than pretending everything's normal. And if I were going to write music I will. I'm going to be writing music until I'm dead, and it's probably always going to try and interact with exactly that intersect between like I don't want to tell somebody to not vote for a Republican in my songs. Like I don't want to tell somebody that they're bad people. I don't want to like preach to the choir and rage with like fellow people who think like I do. I want to make like a more universal, I at least hope to try and make a more universal declaration of just recalling what it is that makes us human, and like for a second pausing and like everyone looking at each other and thinking about what that is, what it's like to be a human being in a world that's so fracturing right now. I also, weirdly, hearing me talk, I'm kind of an optimist about the long-term future of humanity. Like I think we're going to get over these crises. This is one of the, I often say that I hope I'm wrong. This is one thing that I hope I'm right about. But I do think that we'll get past this era. And I think it'll be because people are aware of what's happening to us. I read too much science fiction, or read it too much as a kid anyway, to like give up completely on dystopian future. I'm a utopian sci-fi guy, not a dystopian sci-fi guy.
But would you say that your music is a means to carry a message? Is that the way you see it?
No, I can say that very explicitly and very quickly because it probably does carry a message. I don't deny that it does. But if somebody asked me, I should just send you this new track I'm working on, actually. I think you'd like it.
But today you released United Earth.
I didn't release it yet.
No?
I was supposed to release it yesterday, and I'm still working on the mix. This is a great example of me giving myself the freedom that I demand others try to give themselves. Yeah, it's
So
like,
what about these tracks?
so I'll answer this question and by the time that this comes up, this song will be out. So I'll answer this question by telling people to click the link below to a song called 1.5 Meter Blockade. And yeah, there's clearly a message there, but it's not I don't want it to be a message that's explicit in saying we must do this. I know what to do. Everybody hold hands and peace and love. You know what I mean? It's a if there's a message, it's I don't know what the message is. That said, I don't think that's what most people bring away from it. I think what the people that like my stuff tend to like the things that make them feel, I don't know what they like. I started that sentence and I realized like, I don't know what people like. I don't know what people get out of it. And I deliberately leave it open-ended because for me anyway, it's folly to try and make a statement. I'd much rather make an object that people interact with. You know what I mean? Like an abstract, rather than saying, here is what to do. This is art that reinforces this notion of what to do. I would rather make a more complex object that people can play with. That like a toy that teaches you how to count. Like I want art to be a toy that teaches you how to be a decent human being. That's what I hope there is in it. When it works, it's there. When it's not, it's not. But that's what I go for. And I don't think that's a message. I don't think the message is like, love your fellow man. And I think there's some great music that does have that message. I'm not disparaging music that has messages, but I know that the way I think about it that doesn't quite nail it to say that that's the message. Although on being challenged, if somebody challenged me that, like, well, that itself is a message, isn't it? And I would have to say yes. It's just, it's not a prescriptive message. It's not a message that says do this or feel this. And it's certainly not an introspective. I think this is something that does distinguish my music from a lot of the music that comes out now, is that it's not solipsistic. Like I don't dwell on expression of my feelings. I think there's a lot of emotion in it, but it's not, like I don't want to make my emotions central to it.
Do you feel like there are some things that are easier to sing about? Because one cannot help to notice that, I mean, there are so many things to sing about, but only a few of them are really sung about in circles, actually.
Yeah, and also individuals. I would, but I think I have my own circles, you know? Like, I think we all, as individuals, we have our own little things we sing about. Like, I think you know, people often say like, oh, don't get in a rut. Don't write the same song over and over again. I would disagree. Like, I think you should like write the same song over and over again and keep writing it better and keep writing it better and call it different things until it's really the piece of work that you want to have exist in the world. And it's fine if you're in a rut because that's you focusing on like what you really want to say. That's not always true, but like, I definitely think I have things I focus on. Like I'm much more likely to list a long string of numbers and talk about the Slovakian prime minister or whatever in my music than other people's music are. But that's a theme, right? Like it's something that keeps coming back. So for me, those things are easy to sing about. I'd much rather sing about like European politics in an emotional sense than I would about like heartbreak or whatever. But that doesn't mean that it's bad for people who sing about heartbreak. I think a lot of people, these circles that people sing about over and over again, I think those things are people not really being in touch with what they want to sing about. Their version of me singing about the European Parliament emotionally, everybody has that they probably would write about that isn't just like, my heart is sad and I love you. You know, like they all have something deeper inside them and they just... I think the quality of their work probably corresponds to their ability to reach that and let it poke its head out.
So you would say it's mostly mimetic?
I would love to hear you talk about what you mean by that, because mimetic is one of those words that can come across in so many different ways. The way I'm hearing it is like you're talking about like the noosphere, like the way ideas float around, but maybe you're meaning something different by it.
Yeah, no, that's not what I meant. Although that's an interesting idea, the noosphere and the egregora.
Yeah, I've always understood the word meme in that sense. So when people talk about memes as like, you know,
no, I'm not.
I'm just not familiar with the term in this way. So please go on.
Not meme, M-E-M-E, but mimetic, M-I-M-E, coming from mimesis, the Greek term.
Okay. No, I'm unfamiliar with this, to be frank with you.
Well, it's like Girardi and terminology. So there was
Okay.
there is this French American writer, pretty well known internationally, René Girard, and he came up with this theory of mimetic desire. So basically, we are competing against each other, and desires are things that other people want. I mean, really, to do the short version, like TLDR, and that's how we acquire desires.
Ah, I see what you mean now.
So in that specific case, it would be that everybody's singing about heartbreak, love, and so I guess that's what people do. That's what I should do.
Yeah, I can see people doing this, and I see it actually it's not a young people thing either. It's just like people, when they write songs, they default to things that they think other people are going to understand. And I wish that people would default to things that they were pretty sure that other people wouldn't understand, because that's where the real crazy stuff comes in. I don't think like the crazier the art, the better or anything like that. But I don't know, from my perspective, I'd much rather hear something that's hard to figure out than I would something that's easy to figure out. Like, I know what heartbreak is. We all know what heartbreak is. Tell me what it's like to be nostalgic about a lost pair of sneakers. Tell me what it's like to be embarrassed by a mole on your earlobe that no one ever sees. Like, tell me things that I might not know. Like, expand my emotional experience. That's what I want from art. I don't want to be assuaged. A question I always love asking people is not what kind of music do you like to listen to? Because I think that's basically just giving somebody an opportunity to declare their identity. That's boring. What I ask them is, what's the last thing you listened to on purpose?
But that's putting them on the spot.
Yeah, a bit. But like, I also, so I'll only do that when I'm like, I can tell that like people might, tolerate that kind of conversation. Usually it happens when like you meet a bunch of people at the bar and you're like, oh, these people aren't boring. Okay, let's see what they do. Let's see if they play ball. And I'm thinking back to like what the last thing that I listened to on purpose, and it's Hall & Oates' Private Eyes, like back to back. Do you know this record?
No.
Oh, you got to hear this thing, man.
How's it called? Private
Eyes. It's their main hit. It has that like it has all the hits that you'd know. It has Private Eyes. It has Mano a Mano. It has You Did It in a Minute. Which, parenthetical footnote thing, you did it in a minute. This will go back to the beginning of the episode. When you go to edit this, you'll think this is really funny. So in Russian, the word for the number 4 is четыре. And the song, the chorus goes, you did it, you did it, you did it, you did it, you did it in a minute. And my wife, who is a native Russian speaker, came into the room and said, why are they, like, what's going on there? Are they just saying 4 over and over again? But it's, you did it in a minute, ja did it in a minute. And she heard, четыре, 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 четыре in Russian. Anyway, the reason I brought up that record in answer to your question is what I sought out there. Like, they write about love in this very, like, high tea 80s weightlifter boy vibe, right? They're like completely someone who's not me. Kind of like Tom Cruise playing volleyball in Top Gun. That's what their music feels like. And this is really alien to me, and I just really enjoy that perspective. And there's some real profound beauty in this record, I posit. I don't know much about them as songwriters, frankly, but they have like, dozens of albums. But my point here is, like, I sought out that album not because they're like me, but because they're not. That's how I curate my aesthetic experiences.
I know what you mean. That's a very, very interesting idea. Because actually I had like a talk with my bandmates, and basically in a world in which music has been reduced in many ways to a product, listening to
an identity signifier.
Yeah, exactly. Virtue signaling. Mm-hmm. Listening to a band or another band has become, it's more of a statement about how you want others to look at yourself, and what you think is a good thing to signal than what you like. And so
that's right.
And so interestingly enough, that's why I said, but you would be putting people on the spot there, right? And so I think that's why maybe Spotify's idea, in some ways misguided, to send people at the end of the year, to send them their listening habits, because I found like my top 5 was so funny. I shared it actually, but my top 5 is Meshuggah, Swedish death metal band.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Alan Holdsworth, but before Alan Holdsworth, there's Ariana Grande, and so that would be my top 3 of last year, and I was not even aware of it, and I forgot who else was on there. But and so it was so conflicting, and I shared that, and some of my friends were like, yeah, okay, Ariana Grande, I don't know the other ones, but sure. And some of other people were like, what the, such conflicting messages. And so by asking such a question, you're kind of robbing people of the possibility of virtue signal in a way they are comfortable with, which is interesting.
Right. And you remove the notion, or you remove their ability to virtue signal because they're just like, if they answer the question honestly, they're probably going to say, I put on Chill Morning Vibes playlist, and I have no idea what I listened to. It was some dude singing a cover. And I definitely think that is an objectively bad development in society, that we have now gotten to a point where like we allow curation to happen for us. I actually think it's quite deliberate on Spotify's part. And I'm a Spotify optimist. Like I don't think they're necessarily bad. I think streaming services are a wonderful thing that we don't have to carry around, iPods with MP3s, let alone like vinyl records or whatever. I think that stuff's great. I'm happy that streaming exists. But what doesn't exist on streaming is an easy way to categorize music by label or by like artists that are also in the band. Like it's there, you can do it, but it's not very easy. And the platform would much rather you categorize things by wallpaper, like playlist for feeling rainy Sunday. Like the user interface encourages people to take a passive rather than an active role in the curation of their aesthetic experiences. And more than anything in the world right now, I think that's in danger of lobotomizing the human experience of music in particular, but also just ideas. Like, God forbid, imagine if libraries were that way. Like, oh, what do you feel like? Are you feeling sad? Here's a book for you. Like as opposed to like thinking about what the idea was and having to like actually search for it. Like we're not encouraging people to do that with music right now.
It's interesting because, sorry,
go ahead.
Just finish.
No, please. I'll remember what I was going to say.
We are, I'm sorry, but it feels like we are pushing back always on these nonsensical categories, whether it's with language and words, or right now with like band categorizations, or sad react, the fact that on Facebook you have to choose between, I don't know, 6 different reacts. Yep. And so it's interesting that it's like a trope, this like will to dynamite, to destroy everything that.
Yeah, you mean this idea of putting things in buckets?
Yeah, just like rejecting this idea in whatever avatar, in whatever incarnation it might.
Which actually corresponds to what I was about to say, though, because I was gonna lionize Bandcamp. I love them, and they tag, right? There are genre tags on Bandcamp. I even think they have algorithmic discovery. I don't think there's anything bad about algorithmic discovery, but what I like about them is that you can then follow the path. You can get lost in a maze. You can go to a label that put it out and see what other bands they put out, and you can see a maze not of your experience and how you experience it, but a maze that's made not by you, but by other people and how they relate to one another. It forces you to follow, it doesn't force you, but it allows you at least to follow a path that you didn't write. It's like one of those like meditative gardens in medieval England. There's a distinction between a labyrinth and a maze. The labyrinth has you're not supposed to find anything. You're supposed to walk around in a path not of your choosing. And that's supposed to elevate you to an ecstatic state. That's what the point of labyrinth gardens were when they were first conceived, I think. I don't know much about this history. Look it up. I don't know. I could be wrong. But the notion was you walk around, you don't choose which way you turn. The path chooses for you, but you are turning. And eventually you get out and the journey's over. But in between there and then, you've sort of lost your ego. You've lost your choice and you're allowing other things to lead you in a path. Like how I discovered music, new music, was in some sense quite arbitrary because at the record store, so this was the late 90s, so this was pre-internet for me anyway. The internet was there, but I wasn't downloading MP3s on it yet. And there was a bargain bin in the CD store. So there's all the the actual top 40 CDs, and then there was this thing that people ordered and they wouldn't come pick it up or whatever, and you'd see tapes and CDs in there for like 99 cents, 50 cents, 20 cents in some cases. And I would just go through there and pick albums that looked cool and spend like $10 and come home with like 10 or 15 albums that were like mostly bad, but in some cases like, holy shit, this is amazing. And I don't think there's an equivalent experience on Spotify right now. And I think that people missing out on that is having more effects on the way people experience music than they otherwise would. It's having more effect than people realize, more importantly. I don't want to be a Luddite, like yay streaming services. I'm just saying let's look at what it's missing and try and reintroduce it somehow with whatever the next step might be.
I thought we could maybe talk about the stuff that's going on right now at the moment and try to extrapolate a little bit on the info that we have available. And how do you think that whole coronavirus situation might have an influence on the music business in the years to come?
Well, right now it's a holocaust. Like there are a bunch of venues. I'm speaking to you from my music venue in Berlin. We're lucky. We've got a teeny bit of savings, and we're in Germany, so we got a state grant to hold us over so we can keep paying our staff at least a little bit while we're closed. But I can imagine a ton of music venues that are less established than us that play a huge vital role in the music community are just going to shut down. And I think it would be overly optimistic to say like, oh, then there's going to be a market for new venues to come in and fill the gap. I don't think that's the case. People do these things out of love. It's not a market. The Porter's Five Forces thing doesn't work here. You're basically just ruining people's pet projects with the way the shutdown is being handled. Obviously, we shut down. Obviously, we do everything we can do to make sure that this disease is defeated. I'm not at all advocating that people do DIY shows or whatever in the middle of this. That's very irresponsible. But in the long run, I think it really is going to depend on how much individuals in a community and also the state are willing to support the cultural infrastructure that allows concerts to happen. I'm focusing on venues not just personally because I run one or help a little bit to run one actually, but also because that's in the future increasingly going to be the main way musicians make money more and more and more. So I think I think that right now the immediate term is it's going to be really hard to get shows booked towards the end of 2020 because you're going to see fewer venues. And the ones that are around are only going to want to book shows where they make a bunch of money. So you're going to have a real hard time getting booked if you're a small band. I don't know how this is going to play out in 2021 and beyond. I think a lot remains to be seen. But I definitely think, and I hate to say this, and this is one of those things that I say, or I hope I'm wrong, and I'm going to stick with that. But I think we're looking at, I think the economic crisis we're facing is bigger than 2009 by a order of magnitude, or at least by, 2 or 3 times. I think we're looking at a global economic crisis not dissimilar to the Great Depression. And I have no idea what that looks like for creative people because I have no idea what that looks like for the economy at large. Every time I look, I see more. Today I saw 500 million more people will be in poverty globally than previous. And these numbers just get bigger every time I look. First, I saw 25% unemployment at the end of the year in the United States. Now I'm seeing 33%. Yeah, it's shocking. I think the countries that have social safety nets are going to do better than those without. So I honestly think Donna 115, it's a teeny little venue, 100 cap spot, focuses mainly on jazz and weird experimental stuff. I think we're going to be fine. I think we'll be here. We'll see. I don't know, man. But I know that for my own purposes, I've already lost thousands of euros of revenue. I spent a bunch of money for merch, and now it's sitting in an office in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was supposed to tour on March 12th through the beginning of April, right when all this happened. I bought plane tickets. It's a nightmare, and I don't have any good answers.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I have no idea. But I don't know if the shock is going to be so violent that it might even be existential, and that as musicians, we'll have to start looking for different ways. I mean, it is not a given that the way music is primarily financed is through live performance. And you actually sent me a link to a talk of this guy, Matt Dryhurst.
Yeah.
Which I watched, and I found him very interesting. Interestingly, you said just before you linked me to him that it seemed interesting for you how people that know have different sources for knowledge sometimes have knowledge that completes itself like mosaics and not necessarily intersects. And actually with this guy, Matt Dryhurst, he's a big fan of Mark Fisher. And turns out I'm also
Capitalist Realism.
Yeah, I read that book. I thought it was extremely interesting. And just before I mentioned some Derrida stuff, hauntology, and it's it's all about Mark Fisher. So I thought it was interesting. But so my point was that, he says that smart contracts might be a way for the music industry to find new ways of financing itself. And I mean, maybe not for the music industry, because I don't even know what this is, but for musicians.
Mm-hmm. This is a beautiful model. It's the notion that someone can buy share in you as an artist and buy stock, so that you could make a smart contract. Let's say somebody buys an album. They'd buy a smart contract for it so that anytime that you make money on that album, they'd get a micro kickback from that. And the idea is that if one of those songs got licensed in a film or something, they'd actually make some money off of it. And I like the market. I think markets are cool. I think that when they work well to incentivize creative behavior, That's great. And if we can find a way to do that in a way that scales, that's awesome. You're totally right. It's not just live music. And I do think live music will return. I guess what I'm interested in is what happens if people don't have any money to give us for this like luxury good that we provide, right? Like, it's also not a given that musicians need to exist as a category in an economy at all. Like, I think they do. I want to live in a world in which musicians exist, but I am considering the possibility that at some point in our lifetime, the majority of people won't agree with me. And what happens then? What happens is that we all do it as a passion project in our spare time, which sucks, but which is not, it's not lethal to the notion of art, right? Like, we've gotten through these problems before. We've had great wars in which all artists have gone to fight. There are going to be ways. I think music making will persist. The question is, like, how many people who are economically underprivileged are going to be able to participate? I think that's in grave danger right now. And how much control over the dissemination mechanism are individuals going to be able to exert? I think that's also in grave danger, but that was true before. I think this is really just going to exacerbate pre-existing problems and make them have to be solved sooner. I can tell you some like anecdotal data. The people that I know that make music, like me, on the edge of a living, you know what I mean? Like, we make enough money from our music to, like, if we wanted to eke out an extraordinarily poor existence, we could do it. And that's extremely lucky. Like, we all know how lucky we are to be able to even say that. So in that category of musicians, most of us are like doubling down on our plan Bs right now. You know, like a lot of musicians that you probably, indie musicians that you respect and think are probably just doing that for their career, they're right now doubling down on their plan B. For example, you know, getting more teaching hours, taking on more freelance graphic design clients, doing more web work, that sort of thing. And it reminds me a bit of this anti-fragility concept that we were talking about the other day. Because I read the first couple of paragraphs of each of the Inserto series. I found PDFs of all of them, and that's my reading project right now. I'm just really going to take that dude's ideas on board. We're referring to Taleb, Nassim Taleb. And it made me think of what an anti-fragile response would be to this obliteration of a music economy, right? And I thought about my pattern. Like, he's an investor more than anything. I think I was actually thinking, like, my life is anti-fragile. I realized this because we're in a crisis right now, and so if I had all my eggs in one basket as a musician, I would be screwed. If I was trying to be robust, so that'd be fragile. If I was trying to be robust, I'd try music, but most of my income comes from this one particular steady source. So that would be robust. I'd still be okay because that source I might be able to work from home. But what I've got the musician thing, very high risk. I've also got a foot in the door at BIM and a foot in the door in the tech world. So BIM gave me this temporarily full-time position training other tutors in how to use digital tools for teaching. Like that I didn't design that to happen, but like actually I, as a person, I'm going to be financially better off because of this crisis in the short term than I would have been in the long run. And I'm not certain, yeah, it's luck. Like, yay, I'm not going to pat myself on the back too hard. But I do think there's something about that setup, right? Of like going all in on something, but also making sure that I can learn things quickly and adapt really quickly. These are like the anti-fragility concepts.
Yeah, and that's what he talks about, actually. He has this thing called the barbell strategy. It's like a barbell. You know, you have something that is very robust and something that is very sensible to disorder. And so, and you combine these two things and you got yourself like a pretty good system.
Yep. And that's, I mean, mine's a bit more complicated than that because it's got 3 sources, but like it works. So I was thinking about that, and I was then thinking about, okay, so how can the music community at large learn from this? How can this cooperative label that I'm starting to run with Christian slowly learn from this? Like, what would be another question I posed the other day to some friends is like, what's the equivalent of like buying a beer at a show for online artists? You know, how do we get artists some of that revenue? Like, we need to start thinking about this. And I do not like the business mindset. I don't even like the word business. Like, I think that's stupid. But I think artists need to start to have a market-based, economic-based reality. Like, we're floating in this, like, we are on a ship that is sinking. We cannot, like, our communist ideals will not feed us right now. Like, we need to be able to build that world. And in order to build it, we've got to win on the terms of this dumb game that we've been thrust into. So Yeah, I agree with Dryhurst that like, maybe blockchain's part of it with this, Ethereum based contractual micro contracts. Maybe not. Maybe that's a bit too idealistic. I think blockchain is very overrated in terms of its like individual liberating tendencies, because there is no better way to keep track of people than the blockchain. Like that's an authoritarian's dream. And I think people overestimate the anonymity of Bitcoin and blockchain. And it's not so much about anonymity, it's about getting artists money. How do we get people who aren't nerds to buy Bitcoin so that they could actually participate, or buy Ethereum actually, or other contract-based cryptocurrency where they can actually participate. So I think there are a lot of ways forward, but we're clueless. We get hit by a truck, we're spinning around. I think we'll be all right. I'm going to make music. I think most people who really, really care about it are going to continue to make music, but it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough over the next year or two, I think.
Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, do you know musicians that have been doing it and do it for a living that don't have such a hybrid or mixed strategy? Because It seems to me that I don't know that many musicians that just do this and can live from it.
Well, what you find is that there are people who will have their plan B, but it takes over most of their life, and then they just become like a weekend warrior. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think some of the best songwriters I know follow that model, and it's because they're able to have a stable life and then write songs because they're stable and not poor and crazy. Then there are people who are very, very lucky and they make 100% of their income from music. And those people are the ones who are probably taking the biggest hit right now because all shows are canceled. And then I think what's quite rare is this between thing. I do know other people like this, but it's a less common model, which is like, I'm all in on music and also I'm a badass at this other thing. And the two things don't contradict. Like, I think I know a lot of like graphic design people who like, they'll graphic design on tour, they'll work for clients on tour. I know video editing people, audio editing people. And I know a guy who was on tour at a very high level who was like backstage editing videos for clients. Like there are people who do this and they love their lives. It's stressful, but those people I think are the ones that are going to prosper the most in this. And I consider myself to some degree to be a part of that group. But I mean, talk to me in 6 months, man. Who knows? Like I was talking to my wife this morning. I was like, what happens if like what can I actually do on a barter level? Like I'm a visually impaired, like guy who knows how to computer code and teach people how to play instruments and music theory. Like I think my charisma is probably my biggest asset in the apocalypse. I don't know what I would do with it, but probably be something like the shamanistic thing that we were talking about earlier on. I'd probably be able to, I don't know, lead a postmodern version of a seance or something. I don't like that future. I'd much rather have a future in which I can offer a trade. I think there's something really nice about that. There's an image that sticks with me from Philip K. Dick. I don't remember which book this is in, but it's an image. They find a creature and they find a crab on a planet. It's like, oh, look at this crab we found. Oh, that's cool. And then they realize that the crab is sentient because of the following behavior. The crab walks up to the end of the tank and it like pushes shows them a rock and it's like offering it to them. And it's like, oh, it wants to trade. Like we fed it and it's trying to give us something back in return. And I think there's something like really beautiful about the desire to like give back to people. And I've never felt like as an artist that it's like my living is owed to me. I've always wanted to like earn it somehow. I want to earn it through my art, but I also don't want to, live on the largesse of somebody else and just like, I'm an artist and not really do anything. Just live the identity of an artist without actually making the art. You know what I mean? I don't want to enable that. So I don't know. We'll see. Talk to me in 2021. I think we'll survive, but it's going to be a tough year. And you had a tour canceled too, right? The Italian tour.
Yeah, I think too, because we had 2 legs to that tour. But it's fine. I mean, it sucks, but we did not lose so much money in this. So some people really lost a ton of money.
You know what was hard? We met on Monday for the first time with some of the students that I'm interacting with at BIM, and we met on Zoom. And one of the ways I like to get feedback in the Zoom room, because it's such a stale environment, is rather than having people click the little, this like wave button, this thing, I hate that. Uh, so I tell people just to turn off your mute button and go woo if you agree or disagree. So then the room just sort of explodes into like cacophony when people agree with something. And I said, okay, so how many of you lost gigs, like musician paying gigs? And everyone went like, whoa! It was like a deafening sea of woo. And then I said, interesting. How many of you also lost like your day job, like your cafe job, your restaurant job? And then an even louder, whoa! So like young people who aren't established yet right now are like really, really having a hard time. Yeah, my heart goes out to people like that, man. And to the extent that I can, I'm going to figure out a way to help them. One of the things we did at Dawn Owl actually was we had a fundraiser for the artists. They came in and they live streamed. Their show was canceled, but we did a live stream and we had a donation button on the live stream. And in that week, we raised close to 900 euros for the musicians who were supposed to play here. And they have, that's not much, but it's not nothing. They each got like $100 or something. So
yeah, that's great.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I don't know how to exactly think about the changes that we are seeing right now. I feel like in many ways I like it because the system in some ways, I mean, some things are breaking down, it's like there are bugs in the matrix. You can see that some things are not really, so it's a very interesting thing to see because it helps you parse what's real and what is just a masquerade. But on the other hand, it also feels like it's a great period for Netflix, Spotify, Google, Facebook. All the big companies are polarizing the money even more for video games as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like this for the system to break, like the accelerationist thought of like things have to get worse before they get better. I think there's truth in that, but I think it's also like the people who hurt the most are the people who are already hurting when that happens, and the people who benefit the most are the people who are already benefiting. What's happening in the video game world? I guess those people are making a lot of money now, right?
Yeah. I mean, people are creating much more. I think Nintendo servers were down when they really started. For a day, they were down or something. I don't know.
For Animal Crossing.
Yeah, around that time. But I think it was before it was released. I'm not sure actually. But it's just that people have a lot of time on their hands.
Animal Crossing is really interesting to me. Have you played this game? I haven't. Are you familiar with the concept?
Not that much.
It's like it's one of these open-ended games where it's like you don't have to fight or anything. You have a house and you collect stuff and put it in your house. And you walk around and interact with other people in the game and also characters that Nintendo puts in the game. And it's like a parallel reality in a way. Like I see people now on Facebook and Twitter like posting like, hey, does anybody have any grapefruits to sell on this island? I need some grapefruits. I need to trade for peaches. I was like, what are you talking? It's this parallel reality. And I think it sounds like the metaverse in Neil Stephenson, Snow Crash. Did you ever read that?
No, I don't know it.
But the concept of like a virtual reality world. You put on a headset and you're jacked into the web, man. It's like a very proto version of that, where people are like investing a lot of time and energy into these like very fake, quote unquote, realities.
Yeah, it's like Second Life back in the day.
Yeah, it's like a more fun version of Second Life, exactly. And I'm really interested in how that works. And I'm also wondering if musicians can exploit this somehow. Like maybe, I think maybe you can do an audio feed into Animal Crossing, or if not, they certainly could make it such that you could. Probably somebody's already done this by the time I'm saying this, and certainly by the time people hear this, but like the first gig or the first tour in Animal Crossing, like a band goes on tour to different people's islands in Animal Crossing and find a way to monetize that. Now we're talking.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I was talking with this guy. I had this guy on the podcast recently, The Algorithm, who is like an artist, touring artist, but he also writes video game music. And
cool.
I'm a big fan. I've been a fan of his music for like years, half a decade at least, more. Anyways, and so we were talking about writing music for video games, and I've always thought that, I mean, the video game music I've listened to while I was playing as a child is so dear to me. And I feel like there is something about video games, or movies for that matter, but video games even more so because they're so much more engaging. It's like, in a way, they diffuse your conscious mind because you're doing something else, and the music can seep that much deeper into your unconscious mind and like hit you in the feels. Like, yeah. It's like music and the video game have a symbiotic relationship, but there is also this process which enables the music to go much deeper when you're not paying attention.
Yeah. I'm thinking of so many video game music examples that affect me that were there when I was a kid, and even when I was older. Do you remember a game called Katamari Damacy?
No, I don't know it.
Oh, the soundtrack for this game is absolutely incredible. It was a PlayStation game. one of the more recent PlayStation games. It was probably out in like 2004, 2005, something like that. But it was just absolutely gorgeous music and really weird. It was a surrealistic game. You're a little prince, a little guy that runs around and the whole point of this game is that like you start out really small and you roll up. You have this thing called a katamari. It's like this magnetic ball, and you get dust on it. You get like little, dust mites and pencils, and the ball then gets bigger. And as the ball gets bigger, it can pick up larger objects. So eventually you pick up like, books, cats, whatever. Eventually you're picking up pianos and whole houses, and the game ends where you roll up the entire planet and your ball becomes larger than the Earth itself. So it scales out. So it's a really, kind of magical realist concept, but the music for the game is like, really super happy J-pop or like, Japanese versions of jazz lounge singers. And it, as you said, gets me right in the feels when I hear that soundtrack. And there's something about that like wistfulness of like wasting an entire Saturday playing a game and this music being there as a friend to you the whole time. There's something about that. And it's not like it's nostalgia, but it's more than that. It's like, it really gets in your mind. I've never written music for video games, and I've always wanted to. So maybe that's my next path to cross. And maybe this is a way forward for musicians, right? Like if games are going to become big, games are always going to need music and sound effects. Maybe we just need to get better at learning Unity and like marketing ourselves for video games.
I mean, there are so many great things at the moment being done in the video game music community, and even in the like movie music world. There is this tendency for more soundscaping and different things and more. It's almost acousmatic music. You hear it like more and more. It's so interesting to me.
I don't have a good gaming computer is my problem. I like all my stuff is just music. I don't have one of these like split graphics cards, so I'm bummed. There's a whole part of the world that I'm missing. And my gaming experience, there's this game called Mini Metro, which it's all iPad games that I have. Are you familiar with this game?
Nope.
It's exactly what you think. You just like draw a map for a train, and then like it's very minimalistic. It's just like a line with a box that moves up, and that's the train. And like, there's greater or less demand on different sides of the city for your train, and like that and airplane flight simulators, man.
Yeah.
That's my kink is getting really, really good airplane flight simulators. I think if I have like a golf thing as I age, like again, I'm turning 41 tomorrow, so I'm thinking about this too much. But like if I get a thing as I age that's like my dad hobby, it's gonna be flight simulators. Like
I mean, they have great ones with like controllers that are super developed, and also car simulators. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it's like I'm an RPG guy. That's my thing. I know that if I start playing RPGs, I'm never getting out of it, because I don't know why, but there is even like books as well, but there is something so compelling about this. I remember when a friend of mine described to me the Elder Scrolls, it was Skyrim, and he described Skyrim to me. And I was like, oh, that sounds so good. I'm never going to play this game. I'm not even going to touch it, because if I start playing this, you're never going to hear from me again.
In the world.
Yeah. I mean, I know I have like, if there's a gene for this, probably not. But if there's one, I definitely have it.
Oh, I think there is. I think there's, and not a gene, but like maybe there's a mental ability to like insert yourself into a fictional reality. But I think people too often disparage these things by calling them escapist. And I don't think escapism is like a pejorative term. At least I don't see it that way, because I think we get something out of these games in the same way that we get something out of fiction, like novels or it's different than poetry, but I think you can arrive at profundity this way. Even it's fun, but like I think for a certain kind of person, you can't really just have fun. There's always an extra piece to it, like it's or it's not fun without that piece.
There is something to be said for suspending disbelief. Like it's like using I in mathematics. Yeah, you know what I mean? It allows you to get to a different plane where you can solve equations, like quadratic equations or whatever. I'm really not an expert in that. But yeah, once you allow for the possibility of having a number whose square root is -1.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or once you allow for the fact that like, okay, so on this stage, you're in Rome. Just pretend that's true. What if we were? Suspend disbelief. Yeah, that's a powerful human trait. And then like so much profundity comes of that. And what's amazing is this imaginary number thing underlies everything that we're using right now. Even the simple analog circuits wouldn't work without that. Like, let alone the digital stuff.
Because there was a suspension of disbelief for a second, and it just allowed us. It's crazy.
And that's what makes being human worth it sometimes. So anytime we get a chance to do that.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for being on the podcast. And yeah, that was super interesting.
All right, amigo. Talk to you later on. Be well.
Have a nice
Likewise.
confinement.
Thanks, you too. Quarantine good.
Well, that was the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. And now we're going to move on to the footnotes in a second. But just before, as a short side note, I just wanted to mention that I found out when I was researching and redacting the footnotes that they were just as rhizomically connected as our talk, which I thought was very interesting because a lot of elements ended up connecting several footnotes together. So here they are. Footnote number 1, the observer effect on podcasting. So I think that here Chad is confusing Heisenberg's uncertainty principle with the observer effect. In fact, the two have been frequently confused, evidently even by the originator of the uncertainty principle, Werner Heisenberg. So, the uncertainty principle in its standard form describes how precisely we may measure the position and momentum of a particle at the same time. If we increase the precision in measuring one quantity, we are forced to lose precision in measuring the other. The observer effect, on the other hand, is the theory that the observation of a phenomenon inevitably changes this very phenomenon. For example, if you want to check the pressure on a tire, you're bound to release some air to make the measurement, which would change the value being measured. In quantum physics, the idea is related to the collapse of the wave function in the Copenhagen interpretation and illustrated by the famous thought experiment Schrödinger's cat. According to a 2003 paper by Ozawa and Mazzano, there is a valid alternative version of the uncertainty principle, which is more in the spirit of an observer effect, which fully accounts for the disturbance the observer has on a system and the error incurred. But it's important to note that this is not how the term is most commonly used in practice. If you're interested in all this, I suggest you dig deeper into the subject, and I would recommend you take what I say with a grain of salt, because as far as quantum physics are concerned, I'm really a dilettante. Figuratively though, what Chad is saying is very interesting, and it's true that conversations tend to turn out very differently when they're recorded, and more generally vary greatly depending on the direct and wider cultural environments in which they take place. Signaling theory and preference falsification are two sets of tools from different fields that can be useful to approach this discrepancy. Footnote number 2, the book about French translations of Jabberwocky. The book that I mentioned is titled À travers le Jabberwocky de Lewis Carroll, and it was written by Bernard Cerquiglini. A link for the book is available in the description of this podcast. It's an analysis of different translations that were made of the first verse of Jabberwocky. Footnote number 3, Antagonistic translation and anticipated plagiarism. Artaud translated chapter 6 of Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There under the title L'Arve et l'Homme, with the subtitle Anti-Grammatical Attempt about Lewis Carroll and Against Him. A link for the translation is available in the description. This exercise in translation was part initially of art therapy sessions designed by the psychiatrist Ferdière to try to improve Artaud's condition when he was institutionalized at the Rodé Asylum between 1943 and 1946. The latter later claimed in letters that he had created and written the short poem in centuries past, and that anybody who would read it would realize that it belonged to him, and that it was not in any way the French version of an English text. He also insisted that Carroll's Jabberwocky was nothing but an edulcorated and bland plagiarism of a lost book that he authored, which could be read by anyone regardless of their nationality and mother tongue. 24 years later, in his book Logique du Sens, Gilles Deleuze examines Artaud's claims and looks favorably upon the paradoxical concept of anticipated plagiarism. As a side note, interestingly, he also conceives of Artaud's nonsense, and nonsense in general, as an excess of sense, rather than a dearth thereof. Footnote number 4, Bernstein's Unanswered Question. The Unanswered Question is a series of 6 lectures given at Harvard by Leonard Bernstein in the fall of 1973. They are often referred to as the Norton Lectures. In this series, Bernstein approaches music, quote, in the spirit of cross-disciplines, and famously applies Chomsky's work and challenge of structuralism to try to frame and understand the musical phenomenon. The lectures are an attempt to consider the trajectory of classical music in the 20th century, and their title is a reference to a 1908 piece by Charles Ives. Bernstein's approach has been challenged by many music theorists to varying degrees, but I would still recommend that you watch the series as I think that he's one of the best, if not the best, music educator in recent history. A link to the Norton lectures is available in the description. Footnote number 5. Speaking in tongues or glossolalia. Glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, is a phenomenon in which people speak words that are apparently in languages unknown to the speaker. One definition used by linguists is the fluid vocalizing of speech-like syllables that lack any readily comprehended meaning, in some cases as part of religious practices in which it is believed to be a divine language unknown to the speaker, in which case it's apparented to xenoglossia. Glossolalia is practiced in Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, as well as in other religions. I touch on this phenomenon as it relates to the indoctrination of children by Christian fundamentalist movements in my podcast with Jonathan Pieslak, the link to which is available below. I also mention Judith Becker's work on the subject. Footnote number 6. Language as a Möbius strip. Here, I'm just going to clarify and expand on what I briefly mentioned during the conversation. For Jean-Jacques Lassalle, an important scholar on literary nonsense, a natural language is a system which necessarily includes what is outside of it, in the sense that by defining what is systematic, it automatically defines what is subversive. In a sense, it's a bit like the photograph being contained within its negative. Lassalle takes Saussures' metaphor of signifier and signified as indissolubly linked like two sides of a sheet of paper, and he extends it to grammaticality and ungrammaticality. He goes on to claim that Artaud's great achievement is to make sense and nonsense cohabitate by bending the piece of paper into a Möbius strip. This effort is a way for him to make his words reflect the no, the hyper-negation that permeates his work and allows him to painfully discover himself through language. Footnote number 7. The Falsifiability Criterion. What Chad is referring to here is the criterion developed by British philosopher Karl Popper to solve two problems in the philosophy of science. Distinguishing between science and pseudoscience, that's the demarcation problem, and the impossibility of verification through inductive reasoning. So, in the philosophy of science, falsifiability or refutability is the capacity for a statement, theory, or hypothesis to be contradicted by an event with parts that are separately technologically possible, but which can be together impossible. For example, the law, all swans are white, is falsifiable because here is a black swan contradicts it. And even if there were no black swans and the theory was valid, this contradiction would still make the law falsifiable, because observing that a bird is a swan and seeing that a bird is black would still be separately possible. This criterion has had a lot of success since its introduction in 1934, but it has been criticized in theory and in practice by philosophers such as Lakatos and Feyerabend. Footnote number 8. Douglas Hofstadter's Lectures on Translation. The two lectures, entitled Reflections on Machine Translation and Reflections on Human Translation, took place in 2018 at the University of Cologne in Germany. I highly recommend them both. Links are available in the description box. Footnote number 9. Hermeneutics and the Hermeneutic Circle. Hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of interpretation, especially of religious and philosophical texts. Modern hermeneutics includes semiotics, presuppositions, and pre-understanding, but also includes both verbal and non-verbal communication, which make it different from exegesis. The Hermeneutic Circle describes the process of understanding a text hermeneutically. It refers to the idea that one's understanding of the text as a whole is established by reference to the individual parts, and one's understanding of each individual part by reference to the whole. Neither the whole text nor any individual part can be understood without reference to one another, hence the idea of the circle. However, this circular character of interpretation does not make it impossible to interpret a text. Rather, it stresses that the meaning of a text must be found within its cultural, historical, and literary context. Intertextuality is one of the constitutive elements of this understanding. For example, you will miss some metaphors, connections, and meaning if you watch the movie The Matrix without ever having heard of the universe of Alice in Wonderland. Footnote number 10. Intertextuality and the legacy of Shakespeare. So, I'm not sure that I stand by what I said there in the podcast, in the sense that the Bible and Shakespeare's works are so well referenced and interconnected through art that it would probably be possible to reconstitute them in part or even in whole through secondary sources. But my point stands for less central nodes of the intertextual system. For example, the different branches of paganism are understood to have sprung from the same original tradition thanks to a very small number of nodes. So that would be the two Eddas, Skaldic verses, the Song of the Nibelungs, and Beowulf. And some of these texts, like the latter, Beowulf, were almost lost, which would probably have prevented scholars from drawing many parallels between the paganistic cultures. I give a few more details about Beowulf and the Noel Codex in the podcast with Chris Walker. Link below. Here are a few more examples of syntagmas from Shakespeare's body of work that have become successful memes. So we have, for example, Brave New World, Infinite Jest, All's Well That Ends Well, Pale Fire, All the World's a Stage, Sound and Fury signifying nothing, The Evil That Men Do, or of course, To Be or Not to Be, and there are many, many more. Footnote 11, Quran memorization. The memorization of the Quran is called hifz, and a person having committed it to memory in its entirety is called hafiz or hafiza, meaning guardian or memorizer. Muslims believe that whoever memorizes the Quran and acts upon it will be rewarded by Allah and will rise in status in paradise to a level commensurate with the amount of verses that they can recall. Footnote number 12. The medium is the message and media stylo. The medium is the message is a phrase coined by the Canadian communication thinker Marshall McLuhan and first introduced in his book Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, published in 1964. McLuhan proposes that a communication medium itself, not the messages it carries, should be the primary focus of study, because the medium is what shapes and controls, quote, the scale and form of human association and action. The impact of media is to be found primarily in the way it is consumed, rather than in the pure information it conveys, if there is even such a thing. As I said in the conversation, I don't strictly adhere to McLuhan's thesis, but I find it to be a very useful lens through which to view the world. A related idea that I would like to share here is the concept of caméra stylo, meaning camera pen, as developed by French film theorist and director Alexandre Astruc. So this idea is that the director of a movie is as much the author of it as the screenwriter, that the image on screen works in symbiosis with the dialogues or voiceover, and that the two cannot be simply divided in, on the one hand, support and on the other, content of the movie. So in short, the director uses his camera as a writer would his pen. In his essay titled A Manifesto for Critical Media, media scholar Eric Faden coined the term media stylo as an extension of Astruc's theory to describe video essays and other artifacts resulting from the, quote, pivot to video that we discussed during the conversation. Like films, video essays are not simply essays in a video form. They are a gestalt, and their impact stems from the combination of their constitutive parts. Faden's paper in the journal Mediascape is available below if you would like to read it for yourself. Footnote number 13. Gamebooks and ergodic literature. So as it turns out, Choose Your Own Adventure books are a series of popular gamebooks, that's the generic term, published by Bernstein Books. So gamebooks belong to ergodic literature as defined by Norwegian game and electronic literature scholar Espen Aarseth. This type of literature is characterized as requiring, quote, non-trivial effort to allow the reader to traverse the text. Aarseth goes on to say that, quote, if ergodic literature is to make sense of a concept, there must also be non-ergodic literature, where the effort to traverse the text is trivial, with no extra noematic responsibilities placed on the reader except, for example, eye movement and the periodic or arbitrary turning of pages. So to illustrate this abstract definition with examples, the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant or Harry Potter are pieces of non-ergodic literature, because beyond the noematic effort they require, meaning beyond the mental effort necessary to make sense of the words on the page, they require trivial extra-noematic effort. In that case, that would be simply turning the pages one after the other until you reach the end of the book. Gamebooks, on the other hand, are an example of ergodic literature, because they require readers to do more than simply read a page and move on to the following, as readers have to make choices, jump from one part of the book to another, and also sometimes operate variables, like, for example, the number of arrows that your character has in his quiver. Ergodic, by the way, is a term derived from the Greek words ergon, meaning work, and hodos, meaning path. So, okay, we need to distinguish between two main types of ergodic literature, hypertext and cybertext. Hypertext literature contains links that provide a new context for non-linearity in literature and reader interaction. The reader typically chooses links to move from one node of text to the next, and in this fashion arranges a story from a deeper pool of potential stories. Hypertext literature does not necessarily have to be electronic, and the term is also used from traditionally published books, in which a non-linear narrative and interactive narrative is achieved through internal references. Examples of this include Ulysses by James Joyce, The Garden of Forking Paths by Borges, and Pale Fire by Nabokov. Cybertext is more specific than hypertext, because according to Aarseth, it is defined as, quote, texts that involve calculation in their production of scriptons. The word is derived from cybernetics, a term coined by Norbert Wiener based on the Greek word kybernetes, meaning helmsman. The prefix cyber contains this idea of a feedback loop, of an interaction, of a calculation taking place. So the cybertext is a machine, an ensemble of rules available on a medium, whether electronic or paper, and operated by the user to generate meaning. Examples of cybertext include a conversation with a chatbot, the I Ching, Apollinaire's calligram, or a gamebook. It has been argued that these distinctions are not entirely clear and scholars still debate the fine points of the definitions, but the concept of cybertext and ergodic literature were of seminal importance to new media studies, in particular literary approaches to digital text and to game studies. For example, it's interesting to think of movies and series as being non-ergodic and of video games as being ergodic. The interactive film Black Mirror Bandersnatch would be somewhere in between being a film and a video game there. So to wrap up this footnote and commenting briefly on what Chad was saying there, it seems that if, by and large, game books are not taken seriously by adults, it seems to be mostly a matter of medium, printed book versus video games, and not of modality, ergodic versus non-ergodic. And indeed, Arseth goes into details about different mediums and their specificities. And interestingly, this all harks back to the thesis from McLuhan that we just talked about. Footnote number 14, Wisiadi. So, what you see is all there is, also called Wisiadi, is a cognitive bias described by psychologist Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. According to Wisiadi, people tend to base their beliefs on the information that they have at hand without much regard for its quality or impartiality, and they fail to look for missing or not directly accessible contrary evidence. Footnote 15, Indie Heads podcast with Chad Matheny. In 2016, Chad was invited on the Indie Heads podcast, a link to which is available below. Footnote number 16. Buridan's ass. Jean Buridan, in Latin Johannes Buridanus, was an influential 14th century French philosopher. Buridan, or Buridan, was a teacher in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris for his entire career, focusing in particular on logic and on the works of Aristotle. Buridan sowed the seed of the Copernican revolution in Europe. He developed the concept of impetus, the first step toward the modern concept of inertia, and an important development in the history of medieval science. However, he is most famous for the thought experiment known as Buridan's ass, designed to satirize deterministic conceptions of free will, and positing a situation wherein a donkey that is equally hungry and thirsty is placed precisely midway between a sack of hay and a pail of water, proves incapable of choosing between the two, and dies as a result. Footnote 17. The Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. The Tractatus Logico Philosophicus is the only book-length philosophical work by the Austrian 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein that was published during his lifetime. The goal of the book was to identify the relationship between language and reality, and to define the limits of science. Wittgenstein's later works, notably the posthumously published Philosophical Investigations, criticize many of his earlier ideas exposed in the Tractatus. The book is known to be quite austere, but I expected it to be pure logic in the vein of Principia Mathematica, so in that sense it's easier to follow than I thought it might be. Footnote 18. Sad React. You can find a link below to the song Sad React by Emperor X. Footnote number 19. 1.5 meter blockade. The song 1.5 meter blockade is the first track of Emperor X's new EP titled United League of Quarantine Aerobics, a link to which is available in description. Footnote number 20. The noosphere. The noosphere is a philosophical concept developed and popularized by the French philosopher and Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He defines the noosphere as a sphere of thought encircling the Earth that has emerged through evolution as a consequence of the progressive growth in complexity and consciousness. The noosphere emerges through and is considered by the interaction of human minds. Teilhard considers the noosphere to be as much part of nature as the barysphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere. Teilhard considers that, quote, the social phenomenon is the culmination of, and not the attenuation of, the biological phenomenon. He argues that the noosphere evolves towards ever greater personalization, individuation, and unification of its elements. He saw the Christian notion of love as being the principal driver of the new genesis, that is, the generation of intelligence. According to him, evolution would culminate in the omega point, the result of the progressive convergence of thought and consciousness, which he identified with the eschatological return of Christ. So, of course, this idea is a bit quirky, to say the least, but it's an interesting mental model for sure. The noosphere was developed from Bergsonian creative evolution concepts and concomitantly with Conway's Lloyd Morgan's emergent evolution. It played an important role in the development of ideas around the theory of evolution, and indeed, it sowed the seeds of Hermeneutics, by Richard Dawkins, and of the idiosphere, by Lynch and Hofstadter. Interestingly, this idea of a sphere of thought can also be found in esoteric literature before Teilhard, for example with the egregore, a term popularized by the French writer Victor Hugo, or after him with Terence McKenna's novelty theory that he developed studying the I Ching. It is also to be noted that the Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky also created a related but different theory of the noosphere. Footnote number 21. Mimetic theory of desire. René Girard's mimetic theory posits that human desire is not a linear process, whereby a person autonomously desires an inherently desirable object. Rather, we desire according to the desire of the other. We mimic their aspirations unconsciously. So, in other words, we tend to crowdsource our desires. This leads to zero-sum games, competition, and conflicts, which are resolved, according to Girard, by the scapegoating mechanism. This idea of mimetic desire is one that I keep on coming back to, and that I mentioned on other podcasts. Just like the idea of the noosphere presented before, it's very unscientific, has apparent loopholes, and it is based in part on extrapolating from literary and theological sources. However, it is still an interesting heuristic in my opinion, and the way Peter Thiel, who actually was Girard's student at Stanford, subscribes to his analysis and uses his ideas in interesting ways. Footnote 22. Did it in a minute. There is a link to the song in description if you would like to hear it for yourself. Footnote number 23. Labyrinths and mazes. Initially, the two terms were synonyms, but nowadays scholars tend to agree that labyrinths are characterized by unicursality, meaning that they feature a single path, whereas mazes are multicursal. They present forking paths between which the walker has to choose. They both exist in a variety of different cultures in which they serve ritual, as path for ritual dances or symbolic pilgrimages, apotropaic, meaning to trap or ward off evil spirits, or contemplative purposes. Interestingly, the concept of multicursality and the metaphor of the maze have both been used by Espen Aarseth in his book Cybertext, Perspectives on Ergodic Literature. Footnote number 24. Matt Dryhurst and Mark Fisher. In description, you can find a link to Matt Dryhurst's conference at CTM 2019, which was recommended by Chad. I've also linked to the Cybertime Crisis Conference by Mark Fisher if you would like to get acquainted with his approach. Footnote number 25. Nassim Taleb and the Inserto series. I read all 5 books of the Inserto series, and I recommend you look into Nassim Taleb's ideas. I have linked below one of the talks that he gave on Antifragile that I think is a good introduction to his work. Footnote number 26. The algorithm and video game music. You can find below a link to my podcast with Rémi Gallego, also known as The Algorithm, with whom I discuss video game music making. In the realm of video game music, I am also very fond of the work of Mick Gordon, and I have linked one of his talks below. So that's it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed the podcast and that you've learned something. As far as I'm concerned, it was a pleasure having this conversation with Chad. I must say that I really admire his capacity to be simultaneously intellectually humble and intellectually fearless, generally, and more specifically, in his long-term appraisal of art, of its meaning, and of the evolutions of the socio-political referential in which it unfolds. I am your host, Baptiste Vattiez, and for once, I will let Chad close the episode.
And that was Cross Pollination Podcast.